Today's story is about a very specific type of criminal that is often portrayed in horror movies, but who rarely exists in real life. However, as rare as they are, they do actually exist. And when they decide to wreak havoc, there's often very little anyone can do to stop them. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right podcast because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week. Once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, please ask to borrow the 5-star review button's phone to make a quick call, but instead log on to their Facebook and change their relationship status from married to it's complicated. Also, please subscribe to the MrBallen podcast wherever you listen to podcasts so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. At around 9:30 p.m. on Christmas Eve 1992, 18-year-old Danita Gillette finished up her shift at Rally's, a fast food hamburger restaurant in her hometown of Dayton, Ohio. She hung up her apron, she said goodbye to her coworkers, and then she stepped outside into the freezing 19-degree night air. Danita had not driven a car to work that day, so she pulled her plaid flannel jacket tightly around her to keep warm, and then she began to briskly walk in the direction of her mother's house, which was only a couple of miles away. That night, like every other Christmas Eve night, Danita's family had all gathered up at her mother's house to celebrate. The Gillettes were one of those big families that were very close and who always looked out for each other. When Danita had gotten pregnant when she was only 15 years old, she had told her parents and 7 siblings, all of whom were older than her, that she'd likely have to drop out of school and get a full-time job to provide for this child. But her family's reaction was, "Nonsense. We'll help you raise this baby so you can stay in school and get a good job and still have a great life." And sure enough, from the moment Danita gave birth to her daughter, her entire family stepped up and made themselves available to provide childcare anytime she needed them to. Fast forward a couple of years back to that Christmas Eve night in 1992, and since Danita had to work that shift at Rally's, her daughter, who was now 2 years old, had been spending the night with her family at her mother's house. And so as Danita walked, she suddenly had this urge to call her family and just check in to make sure her daughter was okay, and also just to give them a heads up that she would be there in the next 30 minutes or so. So at around 10 p.m., she stopped at a payphone on the side of the road that was only about a half mile from the Rally's restaurant. She fished some coins out of her pocket, she put them into the slot on the phone, and then she dialed her mother's phone number. As the phone rang, Danita likely was thinking about how much fun it was going to be to see everyone that night. She also likely was looking forward to eating some of her mother's famous chili and cornbread that she always made around this time of the year. At Danita's mother's house, her whole family was sitting around in the living room chatting and having a nice time, just waiting for Danita to arrive. At 10 p.m., when the phone rang in the house, immediately everyone in Danita's family assumed it had to be Danita calling to let them know that she was off work and that she would be home soon. So when the phone was ringing, one of Danita's siblings, Rhonda, she jumped up and she excitedly ran into the kitchen and she pulled the phone off the receiver and she said, "Hello?" expecting to hear her sister's very happy voice on the other end of the line. But instead, she heard silence. Rhonda said, "Hello?" a few more times, but when she was still met with silence, she shrugged and put the receiver back into its cradle, and then she walked back into the living room and she told her family that no, it was not Danita, it must have been a wrong number. Danita's family would stay up for a little while longer waiting for Danita, but she never showed up, and they never actually spoke to her on the phone. Eventually, the family was so tired they decided to just go to bed for the night. They figured Danita must have gotten hung up at work, which was prone to happen, and so they would just have to wait until the next morning to celebrate the holidays with her. Around the time Danita stepped outside of the Rally's restaurant and began making her walk to her mother's house, Dayton, Ohio homicide detective Doyle Burke was finishing Christmas Eve dinner at his grandmother's house in the suburbs with his wife and their 2 young children. Like the Gillettes, the Burkes also liked to get together with family on Christmas Eve at Grandma's. But much as Detective Burke enjoyed the holidays, he'd been a homicide cop long enough to know that just about every week, at least one person got murdered in Dayton. And so chances were good at some point over the next couple of days, he'd be called into work. And sure enough, that Christmas Eve night, after they were done eating, his pager went off, and he looked at the incoming code and it said, "Call work immediately." When he looked up from his pager, he noticed his wife was staring at him. She knew the drill. She knew he would have to leave. When Detective Burke stepped away to call into work, he was told there had been a shooting on Neal Avenue. The victim had been found near a payphone located about a half-mile away from the Rally's restaurant. Detective Burke said goodbye to his family, he hopped in his car, and he headed over to Neal Avenue. When he got there, he saw a ring of police cars and medical personnel all standing in a circle around this payphone. Burke parked his car on a side street and then he walked over, and when he pushed past the ring of people, he saw the victim on the sidewalk right underneath the payphone. It was a young woman lying in a pool of her own frozen blood. It was Donita Gillette. She had been shot 5 times at point-blank range, bullets striking her in the chest, the legs, and the hands. The pattern of wounds on her body suggested she'd tried to shield herself from the bullets, holding up her hands and turning her head away and crouching back like she was trying not to get hit. After she was lying on the ground, either dying or dead, whoever had attacked her ripped her plaid coat off, they took her sneakers off, and they took her backpack that contained only 50 cents. Scattered around her body were .25 caliber aluminum shell casings, which immediately stood out to Burke. That type of ammunition was distinctive. It was generally only used for target shooting because it was not a very powerful ammunition. However, obviously, it was still lethal at close range. Witnesses in the area said they had heard the shots ring out and then saw 2 young men carrying pistols running away from the payphone. Shortly after Donita's family had decided to just go to bed and see Donita in the morning, they heard a knock on the front door. It was Detective Burke telling them that their Donita had been murdered. They were beyond devastated. They couldn't understand why anyone would ever want to harm Donita. She was such a happy person who everyone seemed to love. They just couldn't understand who would do this. When Burke told the family that Donita had been killed near a payphone, and according to witnesses, her murder likely happened sometime around 10 p.m., as soon as the family heard this, they all thought of that strange, silent phone call that Rhonda had answered around 10 p.m. that night. Had that actually been Donita? Had that been her killer? They didn't know, but it just seemed like too much of a coincidence that they would get a call at the same time that she was killed. After leaving the Gillette's household and filing his report on Donita's murder, Detective Burke arrived back at his home just hours before dawn on December 25th. After catching a quick nap, he spent that morning with his family celebrating Christmas, but his heart just wasn't in it. He had been investigating homicides for years, and so over time he had become somewhat desensitized to all of the violence. However, that morning he just kept thinking of Donita Gillette's grief-stricken family when he had told them the news. He also kept thinking about Donita herself, how scared she must have been when she was crouched down trying to shield herself from her attacker. Her family had shown Burke a picture of Donita when she was alive, and she looked like such a vibrant, happy young woman with this big, infectious smile. It just didn't make any sense that someone would kill her over some shoes and a jacket and a backpack with 50 cents in it. Was this actually a personal attack where they knew who Donita was and they were targeting her, and then afterwards they kind of set it up to look like a robbery? Or was this really a robbery? In which case, again, why are you killing someone over things that are worth so little? Burke kept finding himself thinking in circles about her case. He felt like there had to be more to this than met the eye. And he would be right. That night, just before 9 p.m. on Christmas Day, Burke's pager went off again. There had been another murder. This one had taken place in the northern part of Dayton, roughly 2.5 miles from where Donita had been found. The victim was 19-year-old Richmond Maddox. He was found slumped in the driver's seat of a blue Chevy Caprice that had crashed into a tree on the side of the road. But the crash hadn't killed him. What had killed him was a gunshot wound to the right side of his head, fired from point-blank range. And they searched the car. There was no weapon inside of the car, so this was not a suicide. And they checked the exterior of the car, and there was no entry point into the car from a bullet, which means the gun that shot him had been fired from inside the car. Likely, whoever was sitting in the passenger seat or in the back seat had shot this guy in the head. And considering the car had crashed into a tree, indicates that whoever did this, whoever pulled the trigger, had done it while Richmond was actively driving the car. And so in Burke's mind, this indicated that the person who did this had been forced to do this, because it's extremely dangerous to shoot the driver of the vehicle when the car is still moving, because you're going to crash. And so this person who shot Richmond must have been desperate. Maybe they had been kidnapped by Richmond and they were forced to do this. Burke didn't know, but that seemed like the most logical theory. When police spoke to witnesses in the area, they told the police that they heard the crash and they looked outside and they saw what looked like a short young woman, probably a teenager, get up from the ground near the car and then start running away with a limp. Even though no shell casings were found in or around Richmond's car that could, in theory, link his murder to Danita's murder, Burke still had a hunch that these two murders had to be connected. They had occurred less than 24 hours apart, so back to back, and the bodies were found less than a couple miles apart. And in Burke's experience working in homicide, coincidences rarely occurred. Things happen for a reason. And in Burke's mind, he's thinking, these murders are connected. I just got to figure out what the connection is. But Detective Burke's investigation into Richmond Maddox's death only seemed to further complicate things. Richmond's family, who were stunned at the news of his murder, had no idea who would want to kill him, or who the girl fleeing the scene could possibly be. The only girl in Richmond's life that the family could think of that might have been in the car with him was his ex-girlfriend, 16-year-old Laura Taylor, who they described as being very sweet and polite. But when Burke went to Laura Taylor's house on the morning of December 26th to interview Laura, he was in for a shock. Laura had apparently not been home in several days, and her parents were very worried. Hearing that their daughter's ex-boyfriend had been killed, they feared the worst, that something terrible had also happened to Laura. But before Detective Burke could even begin to process this new information, that now, in addition to two strange murders, he also now had a missing juvenile, who very well could be the key to solving what was happening, unbelievably, while he's thinking about all these different things, Burke felt his pager vibrate again. There had been another shooting, this time inside of a mini-market convenience store that was only 3.5 miles south of where Richmond Maddox had been found. This time, there were two victims. Both were still alive, but they were in critical condition. 38-year-old Sarah Abraham was a classic American success story. After immigrating to the United States from war-torn Ethiopia, she and her family worked hard and established businesses in the Dayton area that included a restaurant and a few convenience stores. The convenience store where this shooting took place was the location where Sarah spent the majority of her time. On the day after Christmas, while Detective Burke was speaking to Laura Taylor's family, Sarah Abraham said goodbye to her 3 young children and then headed out the door to go open the convenience store for the day. Once she arrived and she opened the store and went inside, a 71-year-old regular named Jimmy Thompson came in and he stood by the register to chat with her about the holidays. And then at some point, a middle-aged man named Jones Pettis came inside as well, and he began browsing down one of the aisles. A few minutes later, a teenage girl came up to the register and tried to buy a pack of gum, but she was 5 cents short. Jimmy cheerfully reached into his pocket and gave her a nickel. She smiled, took the nickel, put it on the counter, and then she took the gum and walked out of the store. Then, a few minutes after the girl had left, 2 young men entered the store, each holding a pistol. Sarah and Jimmy immediately threw their hands up over their head, and Sarah told the gunman, take anything you want, we'll give you all the money we have, please just don't shoot us. One of the men barked at her to open the cash register and give them all of her money. And so with shaking hands, Sarah reached down and she opened the register, she pulled all the money out, she gave it to them, and then she kept her hands up. She had given them everything they had wanted. But for some reason, the man who had taken the money from her still raised his pistol up. He put it right in her face and he fired 2 shots. One went straight through her mouth and the other went through the top of her head. And then, after she collapsed to the ground, the men began shooting at Jimmy, but amazingly, they missed him despite being right in front of him. And Jimmy, who was thinking on his feet, immediately threw himself kind of over the counter and acted like he had been mortally wounded. And so the gunmen, believing Jimmy was down as well, they turned around and they began walking out of the store. But as they were leaving, they noticed Jones Pettis, who was trying to hide at the end of one of the aisles. And so they just fired at him, striking him in the hand and in the stomach. Then the two gunmen left, they hopped in a car, and they fled. Paramedics would rush Sarah Abraham and Jones Pettis to the hospital. Jones would survive, but Sarah would die from her injuries 5 days later. When Detective Burke arrived at the convenience store that morning, the other officers who were already on scene told him that Jimmy and Jones had not gotten a good look at the shooters. They just said that they were two young men and that they didn't recognize them. After being told this information, Burke stepped inside of the convenience store to have a look around. He was already operating on the idea that this attack had to be linked to Richmond Maddox and to Danita Gillette, because again, the proximity and time to the other murders was just too much to overlook. That couldn't be a coincidence. And sure enough, right as Burke stepped into the store, this hunch of his seemed to be confirmed, because on the blood-stained ground near the counter were several .25 caliber aluminum shell casings, the same distinctive ammunition type that was used in Danita's murder. At this point, Burke was fully convinced these murders had to be linked. But the victims didn't make sense. It would turn out none of the victims' families had ever heard of the other victims or their families. None of the victims worked together or went to school together or had any interaction at all. It just seemed like the victims were kind of random. But as Burke and his partners were discussing how these crimes could be linked, Burke got yet another call. There had just been an attempted shooting at a Dayton gas station. When Burke arrived, they found this hysterical woman named Kathy Henderson, who earlier had been putting air in the tires of her black 1989 Dodge Shadow. When two young men pull into the parking lot, they hop out of the car and they walk right up to her. They raise their guns at her, and then one of them says, "You're gonna die today." And then the two men just started shooting at her. And amazingly, she managed to not get shot and she was able to run to safety, but the two men stole her car. The bullet casings that were found at the scene of this crime were, unsurprisingly, the same distinctive aluminum variety. Clearly, whoever was behind all of these shootings was not showing any signs of slowing down. And so by now, the shootings in Dayton had attracted so much attention that it was not only all over the local media, but it was all over the national media. This was all anybody in the country was talking about, that there was just these rogue people running around Dayton shooting random people, and the police apparently couldn't stop them. And so panic was spreading like a wave amongst Dayton residents and surrounding areas. It didn't seem to matter who you were or what you were doing. Suddenly, everyone felt like they could be next. On the evening of December 26th, shortly after Kathy Henderson's carjacking was reported, Dayton Police Sergeant John Huber was in his patrol car cruising the northwest neighborhood of Dayton when an all-points bulletin came across his radio. The dispatcher said to be on the lookout for the 1989 Dodge Shadow that Kathy Henderson had stolen, and that if they found it, be advised because the occupants were likely the same people perpetrating all of these shootings all over town, and so they were likely armed and dangerous. Huber had developed a knack for finding stolen cars in Dayton. He knew where all the little cutouts were and back alleys were where people like to stash their stolen cars, and so he decided he would just go looking for the Dodge Shadow. And after only being on the hunt for about 20 minutes, he looked down a dark, quiet street just a mile away from where Danita had been killed, and he saw a black Dodge Shadow parked on the side of the road. When he drove up behind it, he saw it was empty, so he called the police station and asked them to run the license plates. And when they called him back, they told him that the plates did not belong to a black Dodge Shadow. They belonged to a blue Pontiac Grand Am, and that the Grand Am was registered to a 34-year-old man named Joseph Wilkerson. Sergeant Huber was confused and thought maybe he had given them the wrong plates, but then he noticed, parked a little ways down the road ahead of the Dodge Shadow, was a blue Pontiac Grand Am. And so on a hunch, Huber drove forward and he took down the Grand Am's license plates and he called back into the police station and he asked them to run those. And they would come back and they would say, well, it turns out the plates on the Grand Am are the plates that should be on Kathy Henderson's Dodge Shadow. Meaning, clearly, in an effort to cover their trail, the suspects had switched the license plates between these two cars. And so naturally, Sergeant Huber picked up his radio and he asked if Joseph Wilkerson had reported his car as stolen. And after a few moments, the radio crackled back from headquarters that no, Joseph Wilkerson had not reported this car stolen. So Huber immediately became very suspicious of this Joseph Wilkerson person and told headquarters they should really send someone over to Joseph's property to talk to him, since most likely he was either one of the shooters or was involved in some way with all of these shootings. Huber said he would stay put on this road and he would stake out these two vehicles and wait to see if anyone came back to claim them. Detective Burke and his team were the ones dispatched to go check out the Wilkerson property. It was a small single-floor white house that was located only about 2.5 miles from where Donita had been killed. Burke opened the front gate that surrounded the property and he walked along the pathway up onto the front porch and he knocked on the front door, but there was no answer. Burke called out that, hey, it's police, you gotta open up, but there was silence in the house. Burke left the porch and walked around to the back of the house and knocked on the back door, but still no one came to the door. However, as Burke and his team stood around the back of the house, they all started to smell something awful. It was this putrid smell that was definitely coming from inside the house. They didn't know what the smell was, but given the circumstances and frankly the urgency to figure out who is behind all these shootings, they decided this smell constituted potential foul play, and so they kicked in the back door and they made entry into the house. Immediately, the smell picked up tenfold. It smelled absolutely horrible inside this house. And just from a quick glance around the inside, it was very obvious this house had been ransacked. Somebody had robbed this house. All the drawers and cabinets had been opened. There was trash and clothing and random pieces of electronics all over the ground. And so the police, they have their guns out, they're scanning around the room and they're yelling out, "Police, if you're here, show yourself, we're coming in." But no one showed themselves. It was all silent in the house. And so the police began carefully stepping through the house, and they eventually turned right and began walking down this one central hallway that seemed to lead to kind of a back room that looked like maybe a bedroom at the end of the hall. And as they're walking down this hallway, the smell is getting stronger and stronger. And then finally they get to the end of this hallway and they look into this room and they can see what is causing the smell. There on the bed in this room was 34-year-old Joseph Wilkerson. His wrists and his ankles had been tied to the 4 posters of the bed with electrical wire, kind of putting him in a spread eagle position on his back. He had no clothes on, but he had a pillow over his chest and his head, and on the outside, on the top of the pillow, were 2 obvious scorch marks. Someone had clearly pressed a gun into that pillow and then fired 2 shots through it into Joseph's chest and his head, killing him. And from the look of his body and the smell, Wilkerson had likely been dead for at least several days. Also on the ground was another aluminum shell casing, meaning almost certainly this murder was connected to all the others. But the police still had no clue who their attackers were. Who were these mysterious 2 young men? Who was this young girl who jumped out of that car? Was that Laura Taylor? Was that the ex-girlfriend? Was she kidnapped? They didn't know. None of it made any sense. Who were the victims? They don't know each other. Why are they being chosen? What is the connection? And so because the police were kind of at a dead end and they really didn't know where to take this case, they set up a tip line that night for people in Dayton and outside of Dayton to call in with any information about any of these shooting victims. And over the first couple of hours that this tip line was established, the callers that were calling in were providing nothing of value. But late that night on the 26th, a call came through from an 18-year-old named Nicholas Woodson. And based on the tone of his voice, it was obvious he was genuinely scared for his life. He told police that he thought he was going to be the next Dayton murder victim. When police asked him why, he said, "Because I know who the killers are. There's 4 of them, and I think they're planning to kill me next to keep me from talking to you." While the police spoke with Nicholas, Sergeant Huber was still hiding out in his patrol car, watching the Dodge Shadow and the Pontiac Grand Am from a distance. He was kind of hidden behind some trees. And at some point, he saw movement in an apartment building situated just opposite where these 2 vehicles were parked. 3 young people walked out of the building. They walked down the front steps out onto the road, and as they crossed over the road towards the 2 vehicles, they were illuminated by the streetlight, and Huber could clearly see there were 2 young men and a small young woman. One of the men climbed into the driver's seat of the Dodge Shadow, while the other 2 climbed into the passenger and back seat of the Shadow. As the driver turned the Shadow on and pulled away from the curb, Huber radioed into headquarters that the vehicle was on the move and he needed backup right away, and then he too pulled away from the curb and began following them. After just 2 blocks, the shadow stopped, and at that moment, Sergeant Huber sped up behind them with his lights on, and immediately the passenger door of the shadow flew open and one of the 2 men took off running, but the other man and the woman stayed in the vehicle. Huber's backup had not arrived yet, so he couldn't worry about the runner. Instead, he stepped out of his car and stood behind his open car door to kind of use it as a shield, and he aimed his pistol at the driver and he yelled for them not to move. Inside the Dodge, the interior light was now on, and it showed the man was still sitting in the driver's seat, not really doing anything, and the young woman who was in the car, who was in the back seat, she was becoming hysterical, and she was screaming at the driver to shoot him now, shoot him now! But the driver didn't do anything. And then moments later, backup arrived, and they were able to pull the man and the woman out of the Dodge without a fight, and they arrested them both. They were 19-year-old Marvalis Keene, and the young woman was none other than 16-year-old Laura Taylor, the ex-girlfriend of Richmond Maddox, whose family had reported her missing. The police searched the nearby buildings for the man who had run, and they quickly found him. He had gone back inside the apartment building that Sergeant Huber had originally seen the trio come out of before they got into the Dodge Shadow. The runner was 17-year-old DeMarcus Smith, and with him in the building he was attempting to hide inside of was 20-year-old Heather Matthews, and she was actively trying to hide DeMarcus. And so both of them were arrested as well. When all 4 of them were brought back to the station, the police noticed that Marvalis was wearing Danita's flannel jacket, and DeMarcus was wearing Danita's sneakers. Additionally, while these 4 were being processed at the police station, a call came in from a team of police investigators who were searching the Dodge Shadow, and they would say that they recovered 2 guns, a .32 caliber Derringer pistol and a .25 caliber pistol that contained the same distinctive aluminum ammunition that was used in almost all of the murders. The police had just caught their killers, and they would soon find out they had done a lot more damage than the public was aware of. The police would interrogate all 4 of them that night, starting with Laura Taylor, who they thought would be the easiest to get information from because she was 16, so she was the youngest, and she was considered to be very kind and thoughtful. But Laura would remain silent for the entire long interrogation, and when she was asked at some point if she wanted to take a break to go use the restroom, she just stood up and urinated directly onto the floor and then sat back down again in silence. But Laura was the only one who acted tough. The other 3 talked, and before long, the police heard the whole awful story of what they had done. It all started back on the night of December 24th, Christmas Eve. Laura, Heather, and Marvalis were sitting around together talking about how they needed money. And at some point, Laura suggested they rob a guy she knew, Joseph Wilkerson. She said he probably had lots of nice things in his house, and I know he has a car, so we can take all of that. The other 2 liked the idea, and so Laura called Joseph and asked him if he wanted to be a part of an orgy with them, and Joseph said yes. So the trio walked over to Joseph's house, he let them in, and then the 2 girls and Joseph walked back into that back bedroom while Marvalis sat on the couch in the living room. In the bedroom, Joseph laid on the bed and he took his clothes off, and Heather and Laura pretended to start taking their clothes off when suddenly Marvalis, as planned, came bursting into the room with his pistol held out in front of him. He aimed it at Joseph and told him not to move, and then he ordered Heather and Laura to tie Joseph's hands and ankles to the 4 posters of the bed. Joseph immediately begins to beg for his life and tells them they can take anything they want in the house. Anything in this house, it's yours, just please don't shoot me. Marvalis instructed the girls to go search his house for valuables. And so while Marvalis is standing there with the gun aimed at Joseph, perhaps in an attempt to kind of bargain his way out of this, says to Marvalis, hey, I have a really amazing gun, a .32 caliber Derringer that I have hidden in the garage. If you want it, I can tell you where it is. And so Marvalis was totally interested, and he said, yeah, tell me where it is. And so Joseph explained where to go in the garage, and so Marvalis left the room, he went into the garage, and he would eventually find this little gun, this .32 caliber gun. And then when Marvalis walked back into the bedroom with Joseph, he promptly walked over to Joseph, grabbed a pillow, He put it over Joseph's chest. Joseph is just looking up at him, wondering what he's doing. And then Marvalis took this new gun, this .32 caliber Derringer, and he pushed it into the pillow, so it was aiming straight down at Joseph's body. Joseph pleaded with him not to shoot him, but Marvalis pulled the trigger and he fired a shot through the pillow into Joseph's chest. Joseph began screaming, and then he made this guttural sound that his whole body began to shake. And so the other two girls, they heard the sound of the shot, so they came running back into the bedroom. And when they saw what was happening, they just stood there. And then Laura looked over at Marvalis and said, "Hey, can I shoot him too?" And Marvalis says, "Sure." And he hands her the .32 caliber Derringer, the one they had taken from the garage. And Laura takes the gun, she walks over to the still shaking Wilkerson, she repositions the pillow on his face, she pushes the Derringer into the pillow, aiming right at Joseph's face, and then she pulls the trigger, but it doesn't fire. And so frustrated, she turns away from Wilkerson, who's still making all sorts of noise, he's still shaking, and she walks over to Marvalis and says, "Let me use your gun." And so Marvalis pulls out a .25 caliber gun. It was his gun. It was the gun that used aluminum shell casing rounds. And he hands it to Laura. And so Laura hands him the Derringer. She takes the .25 caliber, and then she walks right next to Joseph again. She grabs the pillow and makes sure it's flush to his face. She puts the .25 caliber gun up against the pillow, aiming it right at Joseph's face, and then she pulls the trigger. This time the gun would fire, and as soon as it did, Joseph's body stopped shaking and he went limp. As the trio stood there staring at Joseph Wilkerson's lifeless body, they all realized something. Killing was actually quite fun. The trio left the bedroom and began eating Wilkerson's food and watching his TV and looking for things to steal, all the while happily talking about how amazing the killing experience had just been. Eventually, though, their killing high had worn off, and they realized that Wilkerson did not have any cash in the house, and really, he didn't have nice stuff in his house, so they couldn't really even sell very much of it for very much money. And so they decided they needed to go rob somebody else to get the money they needed. But first, they recruited another friend of theirs, DeMarcus Smith, to come over and join them. When DeMarcus arrived, he, along with Laura and Marvalis, left Wilkerson's house, leaving Heather behind to watch over the place. The trio walked away from the house towards town, keeping an eye out for anyone who was out alone and could potentially be an easy target to mug. And eventually, around 10 p.m., they spotted a young woman they didn't know standing near a payphone. It was Danita, and she was fishing coins out of her pocket to put into the phone. By the time Danita had finished dialing the number of her mother's house, she heard the sound of Marvalis and DeMarcus come running up behind her, and when she turned around, she saw they had guns pointing at her, so she dropped the phone. Then the two men demanded she give them her shoes, which she instantly did, but then, simply because he thought it would be fun, Marvalis still just started shooting her. So he shot Danita 4 times, and then DeMarcus, who had not been a part of the Wilkerson killing, just immediately joined in, and he shot her a 5th time. After she was laying on the ground, dead or dying, the two men yanked her plaid jacket and her backpack off, and then they ran back to Laura on the other side of the road, and the trio retreated back to the Wilkerson house. When Danita's sister, Rhonda, picked up that phone call around 10 p.m. and was met with silence, that really had been her sister Danita calling, but Danita had died literally seconds before the line had connected. Even though, once again, their robbery target did not yield them very much in terms of monetary value, the friends felt like this second murder was still a really good thing. It was a turning point for them. They felt invincible. Killing was the best high that any of them had ever experienced. So in some ways, it didn't matter that they weren't making any money out of these robberies. It was the killing part they liked. To celebrate their murders, the 4 friends threw a party that night at Wilkerson's house. So Wilkerson's dead body is just literally decomposing in the bedroom. They just shut the door during this party. One of the people who showed up to this party was Jeffrey Wright, one of Heather's former boyfriends. And at some point in the night, Heather and Jeffrey got into this huge argument, and Jeffrey grabbed Heather by the hair and started dragging her into a back room. And so, drawn by the commotion of this, Marvalis burst into the room after them and chased Jeffrey, who leapt out of a window. Marvalis jumped out of the window after him and then began shooting at him, hitting Jeffrey 4 times in the legs as he ran away. Miraculously, Jeffrey would make it to a hospital and he would survive, though he would not go to police and tell them what happened. Seeing Heather's ex-boyfriend get shot excited Laura, and she decided she wanted to shoot her ex-boyfriend too. So the next day, on Christmas, Laura called up Richmond Maddox and asked him if he wanted to have sex with her at a nearby motel. When he said yes, she told him he would have to pay for the motel, so bring cash. Richmond agreed, and when he arrived at the designated meeting place that day, Laura climbed into the front passenger seat next to him, knowing full well she was going to kill him and steal the money out of his wallet first chance she got. But after they took off, Richmond looked in his rearview mirror and he saw Marvallis and DeMarcus following them in a car. Sensing this was a setup, Richmond hit the gas, and without any hesitation, Laura pulled out the .32 caliber Derringer pistol they had stolen from Wilkerson. She placed it against Richmond's right temple and she fired. Then she threw herself out of the moving car right before it crashed into the tree. Marvallis and DeMarcus would swing by and pick her up a little ways down the road, and then the trio would head back to their base of operations, the Wilkerson house. At this point, the foursome had killed 3 people and nearly killed a 4th. But while they were very pleased with this, they still hadn't managed to take anything of real value from any of their victims, and realistically, even though the killing was fun, they did need cash. They had no money. So the next morning, on December 26th, Laura, Marvallis, DeMarcus, and Heather decided they would rob a convenience store. So they pulled up in front of Sarah Abraham's store, and while Heather, DeMarcus, and Marvallis waited outside in the car, Laura went in to scope the place out. After going inside and counting how many people were in there, although she counted wrong, she walked up to the counter to buy gum, but she was a nickel short. However, 71-year-old Jimmy Thompson gave her the nickel she needed, and so she bought the gum, she smiled, and she made her way out. When she walked back outside, she hopped into the car, and she told DeMarcus and Marvallis that it was just 2 people inside, the cashier and the man who had given her a nickel. She had not seen Jones Pettis, who was at the end of one of the aisles. So DeMarcus and Marvallis go inside the shop, and they hold Sarah and Jimmy at gunpoint, and after getting all the cash out of the cash register, which was only $40, the urge to kill became too much for Marvallis to control. And so he raised his gun, he aimed it at Sarah, and he shot her in the face. DeMarcus would attempt to shoot Jimmy, but he would miss, and then the pair on their way out would notice Jones at the end of the aisle, and even though he posed absolutely no threat to them, they shot at him anyways. After Heather drove them away from the convenience store, they stopped at a gas station for reasons we don't really know, at which point DeMarcus and Marvallis, they see this woman, Kathy Henderson, who's just completely minding her own business. She's putting air in her Dodge Shadows tires, and they decide they're going to kill her too. So they hop out of the car, they walk over to her, and Marvallis literally says to her, "You're going to die today," and then he raises his gun and he begins shooting at her, as does DeMarcus. But amazingly, they miss her, and so she gets away. She does not get shot, and then they just steal her car. Even though by now the foursome had left behind an astounding amount of evidence that 100% was going to get them caught eventually. Despite that, their only fear at this time was that 2 of their friends, 18-year-old Marvin Washington and 16-year-old Wendy Cottrill, might snitch and turn them in. Marvin and Wendy had been present at that big party at the Wilkerson's house and had overheard the foursome talking about the murders, and the foursome knew they had overheard. But strangely, Wendy and Marvin were not the only people at that party who had overheard them. 18-year-old Nicholas Woodson was also at this party, and he overheard, and they knew he overheard. But for some reason, the foursome had identified Marvin and Wendy as the most likely to snitch. And so Marvallis confronted the pair about this, and he told them they would have to come along for the next murder to prove their loyalty and trustworthiness. And Wendy and Marvin agreed. And so that night, on December 26th, Marvallis and DeMarcus drove Marvin and Wendy out to the edge of town to this gravel pit. And when they got there and parked the car, Wendy and Marvin realized they were the next murder victims. They pleaded with Marvallis to let them go, that they wouldn't say anything, they promised, but he wasn't having it. Marvin eventually got out of the car and DeMarcus followed, and DeMarcus told Marvin to get on his knees, which he did, and then DeMarcus shot him in the back of the head, execution style. And so Wendy has seen this happen, so she knows she's next, and she begins screaming and begging for her life, and she grabs onto the inside of the car so as not to get pulled out. But DeMarcus comes back over to the car, he grabs her and starts pulling on her, and then Marvalis as well comes around and he grabs onto her too. And between the two of them, they're able to pull Wendy out of the car, at which point Marvalis told her to open her mouth. And eventually she would, and Marvalis put the pistol, the .25 caliber pistol, into her mouth, and he told her to bite the barrel. And then when she was biting the barrel, he pulled the trigger. The killers left the bodies where they fell and just hopped back in their car and headed back into town. Nicholas Woodson likely knew that Marvin and Wendy had just been killed for snitching. And so he's thinking to himself, I overheard them talking about the murders. What's stopping Marvalis and DeMarcus from killing me next? I know about the murders, and they know that. And so that was the point at which Nicholas would call the tip line, and he would say, I know who the killers are. It's these 4 people. And literally, practically at the exact same time that Nicholas was giving this tip, Sergeant Huber had spotted Marvalis and DeMarcus and Laura getting into the Dodge Shadow, which would lead to their arrest as well as Heather Matthews' arrest. After going to trial a year later, Laura Taylor, Heather Matthews, and DeMarcus Smith would all receive life sentences. As for Marvalis Keene, who was effectively the ringleader of the foursome, he would be sentenced to death. His execution was carried out on July 21st, 2009. He died by lethal injection. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please ask to borrow the 5-star review button's phone to make a quick call, but instead log on to their Facebook and change their relationship status from married to it's complicated. Also, please subscribe to the MrBallen podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, Google, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories I have posted on my YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. If you want to get in touch with me, please send me a direct message on any major social media platform. My username on all of them is just @MrBallen, and I really do read the majority of my DMs. Lastly, we have some really cool merchandise, so head on over to shopmrballen.com to have a look. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. In late December of 2003, a 32-year-old man named Russell drove along scenic back roads on an island off the coast of Washington state until he arrived at his destination, a house tucked way back in the woods. After driving down the property's long driveway, Russell pulled into a parking spot and came to a stop. After turning off his car's engine, Russell went to unbuckle himself when he stopped, because right in front of him in the tree line, he saw a figure moving in the shadows. As Russell leaned forward and strained his eyes to see who it was, the figure suddenly emerged and began walking quickly toward Russell's car. At first, Russell thought he knew who this person was, but as they got closer, Russell realized he didn't. But before Russell could do anything about this situation, this stranger had arrived right outside of Russell's car door and had begun staring down at Russell through the glass. As they did this, Russell turned to look up at them, and what he saw was so shocking, he just froze in terror. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast, because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, please offer to make the 5-star review button's bed, but when doing so, spread a thin layer of sand between their sheets. Also, please subscribe to the MrBallen podcast wherever you listen to podcasts so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. "32-year-old Russell Douglas climbed into the driver's seat of his bright yellow Chevy Tracker. Even though the forecast called for rain and clouds, there was nowhere Russell would rather have been than right where he was, on beautiful Whidbey Island, the place where Russell had spent most of his life. Just 35 miles long and 10 miles across at its widest point, Whidbey is the largest of 9 islands that make up the state of Washington's island county. All of the islands are clustered amid bays and inlets inside a body of water just off the western edge of Washington called the Puget Sound. The islands are all close enough to the mainland that you can look out over the sound and see the Olympic mountain range along the coast of Washington. But for islanders like Russell, Whidbey was a world away from the hustle and bustle and confusion of the mainland. And Whidbey's artsy little town of Langley, where Russell was spending this Christmas holiday, felt as much like a true home as the larger town further north, where he had actually grown up with his mom, stepdad, his brother, and sister. Before starting his car and heading west to the town of Freeland to run a few errands, Russell took a long look at the house he had once shared with Brenna, his wife of 9 years. Russell was not a person who had a lot of wonderful days, but on this particular morning, he was feeling better and happier than he had felt in a really long time. It was the day after Christmas, December 26, 2003, and after a 7-month-long separation from Brenna and their 2 children, it now felt to Russell like he and his high school sweetheart might actually succeed in rebuilding their marriage and their relationship. Although Russell couldn't see any sign that Brenna was watching him leave or blowing him a kiss from a downstairs window, Russell still peered up at the house from the driver's seat and gave a wave and smiled before finally starting the engine and backing down the driveway. Even as he dropped his hand back down to the steering wheel, Russell knew that he was already expecting too much from Brenna. Russell had a habit of blaming circumstances, and in particular his mother and her strict upbringing, for many of the problems he experienced as an adult. But he was not blind to his own faults. Even before their separation, his marriage with Brenna had never been easy, which was one of the reasons why they waited almost a year after their first son Jack was born to get married. Russell knew that both he and Brenna were quick to get angry at each other, and Russell's habit of self-examination seemed like a waste of time to Brenna. To her, the questions that Russell jotted down to himself, like, "Why are you so afraid to just be without Brenna?" or "Why are you holding yourself and Brenna in the kids' back?" were pointless. Russell just needed to make a decision one way or the other about their marriage and about what he wanted. Russell also knew he was subject to mood swings, and that he spent more time feeling depressed than he spent feeling upbeat. But no matter what he tried, therapy, the regular exercise that kept him trim and fit, writing those notes to himself, it still never took much for him to sink into a dark place. And Russell also knew that the chance he had now to try again with Brenna might be a very uphill struggle. Because during their separation, even though he had told himself that he'd use the time to think about their marriage, instead of actually doing that, almost immediately, Russell had struck up a new relationship with another woman, 50-year-old Marge Bailey. And even though their affair was over now, Russell knew it was still a huge sore spot for Brenna. But what Russell could never explain to Brenna was that that affair had actually helped him grow up and stop thinking of himself as a victim of his moods and of his overly strict and rigid upbringing. And when Russell had met Marge at a bar in the Washington resort town of Ocean Shores, shortly after he and Brenna had separated back in April of 2003, the last thing on his mind was a sexual relationship with Marge. But leaving Whidbey Island and his kids had been very difficult, and the small apartment he had rented in Renton, a suburb south of Seattle, was a typical and depressing bachelor pad, more like a storage container for his belongings than a home. And although his apartment was just 45 miles away from where Brenna lived with their kids, no sooner had Russell left the island that he felt the depression that he had always struggled with settle over him like a black cloud. So when Marge had walked up to Russell when he was sitting alone at the bar in Ocean Shores, he was grateful for her company. And right away, Russell and Marge had hit it off. It didn't take Russell long to discover that Marge was much more relaxed and open-minded than Brenna had been when it came to sex, and also when it came to Russell's own unconventional taste in clothes. If Russell wanted to wear a kilt or a sarong, a length of fabric that's tied around the waist like a skirt, that was fine with Marge. And if he wore pink spandex shorts and a gold necklace to his fitness club, that didn't bother her either. It was also fine with Marge that Russell was still married, and that he was not even sure if he wanted a divorce or not. And when Russell and Marge had finally ended their affair just a few weeks earlier, Marge had told him that if his marriage was really important to him, then he should try his best to fix it. So that's what Russell had decided he would do. According to the separation agreement that he and Brenna had worked out back in the spring, this was the Christmas that Russell was supposed to have 8-year-old Jack and 5-year-old Hannah. But when Russell had told Brenna that his affair with Marge was over, he'd also floated the idea to Brenna that he could just come to Whidbey Island over Christmas and all 4 of them, him and Brenna and their 2 kids, could spend the holiday together at their house in Langley. And Brenna had said yes. As Russell slowed down to make a left onto the main route that would lead him 13 miles west to Freeland, he looked down at his blue jeans and flannel shirt. Of course, along with agreeing to this Christmas reunion, Brenna had had a lot of other things to say as well, including the fact that she'd had enough of what she called Russell's deviant lifestyle. And by that, she didn't just mean his sense of adventure when it came to sex, but also his collection of slightly wild clothes. And even though Russell had been careful to dress in a style Brenna found acceptable during this reunion, he knew that since his arrival, he had already made at least one serious mistake. He'd been so excited about getting back together with Brenna that when he showed up for Christmas, he had given her some fancy lingerie, and inside the lingerie gift box, tucked under the folds of suggestive and flimsy fabric, he'd slipped an assortment of flavored condoms. Still, Brenna's annoyance with him had not stopped them from making love together earlier that very morning. And now, as Russell drove through some of the most beautiful landscapes in the Pacific Northwest, that voice inside him that constantly second-guessed his decisions and made him feel like happiness and contentment were always going to be out of his reach seemed to fade away. Not only was Russell back on his beloved Whidbey Island with Brenna and his kids, financially his life was also improving. He'd recently gotten a small, but to him very meaningful, promotion at the land management company where he worked, and in just 4 months, he'd finish his online master's degree in business administration. He knew that the hairstyling business he and Brenna had bought together a year ago, so Brenna, a licensed beautician, could have her own salon, needed an infusion of cash to cover some debt Brenna had run up. But if they could make their marriage work, his skill with money management, coupled with her skills as a beautician, could put them on the path towards a comfortable financial future. He also knew that that kind of security and status was very important to Brenna. Even though she had never gone to college or spent really any time off of Whidbey Island, Brenna had a few close friends whose lives she envied. One of them was her best friend, Peggy Sue Thomas, who also happened to be a licensed hairstylist, as well as the owner of the house that Russell and Brenna rented in Langley. Although Russell had never been close friends with Peggy Sue, who was 4 years older than he and Brenna, it was impossible to grow up on Whidbey Island and not know about the 6-foot-tall high school basketball star from Langley with the outsized personality and fiery red hair. After high school, Peggy got married and then got her beautician license, just as Brenna would later do. But after Peggy's first marriage fell apart, she surprised everybody by joining the military and becoming one of the few female aircraft mechanics in the U.S. Navy. After that, Peggy went on to marry a fellow veteran, and when she left the service, she raised 2 daughters, and in addition to working on and off as a hairstylist alongside Brenna, Peggy Sue also got a job as a car mechanic. And when her second marriage ended in divorce as well in the 1990s, Peggy Sue responded to the fact that her husband had left her for another woman by hitting the gym. By the year 2000, Peggy Sue had lost 100 pounds, and that year, she won the Mrs. Washington beauty pageant. And now Peggy Sue was out in Las Vegas, Nevada, living the high life with her 2 daughters. It was hard not to feel a little jealous of Peggy Sue with her confident good looks and her grit, but at least if Russell and Brenna could get their marriage straightened out, they could actually buy Peggy Sue's house, since that had been the original plan back when Peggy Sue had moved to Las Vegas and agreed to rent the house to him and Brenna. As Russell made yet another decision, he would definitely talk to Brenna about buying that house. He also made a quick mental review of the directions he needed to follow to get to his next destination, an address on Wall Road just outside of Freeland. He was not familiar with this particular area he was going to, All he really knew was that Wall Road was about 4 miles outside of Freeland, and that lining the narrow roadway was a mixture of everything from churches to upscale homes and million-dollar getaway lodges for summer residents to rustic cabins and the occasional trailer. Looking out his car window at the hills that fell away to the ocean on his left, and catching a glimpse now and then between the trees of the white sailboats bobbing out on Puget Sound, Russell thought of the hikes he could take here with his children. Much as Russell had enjoyed his brief time with his lover Marge, he was now feeling like the separation had finally shown him how important his wife Brenna was in his life, the one constant that had given him more happiness and security than anything else. For Russell, that insight alone had felt like a huge win, and as he thought about it, he bumped the steering wheel with his fist in a gesture of celebration that he felt so ready to make this reconciliation with Brenna work for both of them. As Russell neared his destination, he slowed and began looking to the left and the right for the landmarks that would confirm he was in the right place. As he did this, he reminded himself that he just needed to be patient and give Brenna the time she needed to accept him back into her life. A little bit distracted by this thought, Russell turned into what turned out to be the wrong driveway. He knew he had made a mistake when he saw a red Volvo parked up ahead of him. He'd been told to look for an empty driveway. So he immediately stopped his car, he backed up, and resumed driving west on Wall Road, but very slowly now since he knew he must be getting close to his destination. And sure enough, several hundred yards further along, Russell saw that he'd arrived at the right place, 6665 Wall Road. He turned his Chevy Tracker onto the long driveway and drove to the end of it, where he pulled off to the right side into a parking spot that was at a right angle to the driveway. Beside him were 2 fir trees that cast a dark shadow over his vehicle. But before Russell could pull off the sunglasses he always used when driving so he could see better into the thickly forested and shady area in front of him, he noticed a figure emerge from the woods in front of him, and this person began walking directly toward him. Russell turned off his car engine, but before he could undo his seatbelt so he could get out of the car and greet this person, the person from the woods had rushed up right next to Russell's car door, blocking him from opening it. Russell turned to look at the stranger to see what they wanted, and when he realized what they were doing, he froze with fear. A few seconds later, and the world that Russell had finally begun piecing together in his mind for himself and his family ended in a sudden and terrific blow to his head. Almost 5 hours later, at about 4:30 p.m., 2 women who were residents of Freeland, who lived on Wall Road, were surprised to see a yellow Chevy Tracker parked in the driveway of one of their neighbors' houses. Not only was the car unfamiliar to them, but they could see in the near darkness that the driver's side door was open and the interior dome light of the car was still on. Also, the women knew that the owners of the house where the car was parked, the Black family, were not in town. They had gone to Costa Rica for a vacation. So the 2 women were very curious about who owned this yellow car and why they were there. However, none of the women wanted to approach this vehicle and anyone who might be inside of it when it was this dark outside and no one else was around. So the 2 women decided that if the car was still there tomorrow, they'd call the police. Then the 2 women just resumed their walk, made their way back to their own houses, and forgot about the bright yellow car with the open door. It wasn't until the afternoon of the next day, December 27th, that a dad out walking with his sons under a cloudy winter sky would also spot the yellow Chevy Tracker. Like the women who had been out walking the night before, Joseph Doucette, a school teacher who was staying with his family in a nearby cabin, was also immediately drawn to the car's open door. Joseph's first impulse was to walk over and shut the door before the interior light drained the car's battery, but when he called out and no one inside the car answered, he felt a sudden shiver of uneasiness, and instead of approaching the car right then, he turned around and took his kids back to the cabin. And then, at a slow run, he returned to the car alone, feeling a mixture of urgency but also fear. Telling himself to get a grip, Joseph took a deep breath and then walked down the long driveway. When he reached the open car door and looked inside, what he saw was so shocking and gruesome, he practically fell backwards as he tried to step away. There was a man inside the yellow car. Joseph registered that the man was young with sandy blonde hair and that once he must have been handsome. but now something red and sticky was hanging from his forehead, and the man's clothes were covered in blood. His head and shoulders were slumped over the steering wheel, and his hands lay in his lap, the fingers balled into tight fists. Trying to keep from vomiting, Joseph turned around and began running while pulling out his cell phone and dialing 911. And 8 minutes later, at 4:34 p.m., as the sun fell below the horizon, the first police car arrived on the scene. Not long after that, the dark, quiet road was filled with other police and emergency vehicles and flashing blue and red lights. It didn't take long for the first medical responders to realize they were too late. The man inside of the car was obviously dead, and he was obviously dead from a bullet wound to the head. And once detectives arrived on the scene, it didn't take them long to realize that their first assumption about what had happened to the driver of this car was completely wrong. For the last 55 years, I've been living by myself in a sea cave off the coast of Kansas, slowly piecing together my life's work, a 4,000-page novel titled Sheldon. It's a coming-of-age story about a 330,000-pound blue whale named Sheldon who struggles to make ends meet as a waiter in New York City during the 1920s. And just last week, I finally completed this novel, and I sent it off to my publisher, and then feeling triumphant, I left my cave and rejoined my living family members back in society. However, there was a problem, one that some say I should have been more aware of over those 55 years I spent in that cave. And that was that I didn't know how to spell or use proper grammar or use proper punctuation. And so even though I saw beautiful prose on those 4,000 pages I submitted, my publisher only saw thousands of crude drawings of blue whales and skyscrapers. While my novel may need to be reworked slightly, yours won't have to be if you just use Grammarly, the internet's most popular writing assistant. The free version of Grammarly offers comprehensive spelling, grammar, and punctuation suggestions, instantly proofreading all of your work as you write, so you can be sure it's mistake-free before you ever turn anything in. Grammarly Premium comes with even more advanced features like Clarity full sentence rewrites, which flags and rephrases hard-to-read sentences, cutting down on jargon and making your writing so much easier to read. Premium even comes with built-in plagiarism detection. To top it all off, Grammarly is completely free to download and works on all your favorite devices and apps. So if living in sea caves for decades at a time while writing novels about landlocked whales is of interest to you, or if you're a student who is required to write stuff, then you need to give Grammarly a shot today. Improve your grades with fewer all-nighters by using Grammarly. Sign up for free today at grammarly.com/MrBallen and get 20% off when you're ready to upgrade to Grammarly Premium. That's grammarly.com/MrBallen. Given the fact that the residence where this man was found was not only totally isolated, but looked obviously vacant, it would turn out the black family who owned the property really had been on vacation in Costa Rica at the time, and they would tell police they were not expecting anyone to be on their property while they were gone. And the fact that the driver was still buckled into his car seat, Detective Mike Plumberg's initial theory was that this must have been a suicide, that this man found this isolated place, and this is where he took his life. Violent crimes on Whidbey Island were rare, but the suicide rate among islanders was actually pretty high, especially over the holidays. But even with the help of portable lighting that police used to illuminate the area around the car, officers could not find the one item that would even make suicide in this case a possibility, and that was the gun that had fired the fatal shot. But tucked away between the driver's seat and the door frame, Detective Plumberg did find the one item that would eventually prove critical to solving what he now realized was a homicide: the spent shell casing from a gun later identified as a .380 caliber Bersa pistol. Figuring out who the victim was did not take long. Whidbey Island was a small place where pretty much everyone knew each other. So when detectives examined the wallet inside the pocket of the dead man's pants, they recognized both his name and the Langley address printed on his driver's license. In the picture that stared back at them from the license, they recognized what was left of the driver's face. The murder victim was 32-year-old Russell Douglas. By 10 o'clock that night, the detectives were ready to clear the crime scene. Russell's body had been transported to the medical examiner's office for an autopsy, crime scene techs had photographed and collected evidence, and police who had been sent out to interview nearby residents had already come back with 2 helpful pieces of information that would give them a window for when the crime had occurred. According to the owner of a house just down Wall Road, a yellow SUV had entered and then quickly exited her driveway where her red Volvo was parked between 11:30 and noon the previous day. And the 2 local women who were out for a walk the previous afternoon told police that they had seen the yellow car at the end of the Black's driveway at about 4:30 p.m. So the police knew the murder probably occurred between 11:30 a.m. and 4:30 p.m. What police did not uncover was any information about other unfamiliar cars or people entering or leaving the area during that time period. But before the police could move ahead with their investigation, Detective Plumfield and his partner needed to inform the victim's wife, Brenna Douglas, that her husband was dead. So at about 10:15 p.m. on December 27th, the 2 officers were standing at the front door of the Douglases' modest house on Furman Ave in the town of Langley. Even though the lights in the house were out, the door was opened almost immediately. Brenna, a big, strong woman with curly brown hair, was standing in front of them, dressed in her nightclothes. Without asking why they were there, Brenna exchanged a short greeting and then invited the men inside. When one of the detectives asked if they could all sit down to talk, Brenna led them to the dining room table. As Detective Plumberg pulled out a pad of paper so he could take some notes, Brenna settled herself into her chair on the other side of the table and looked out at them with a blank expression. In any murder case, the spouse is always one of the first people of interest. So instead of disclosing that Russell was dead, the detectives began by asking Brenna when she had last seen her husband. Over the next hour, even after police told Brenna that they had just discovered Russell's body in his yellow car and that he had been shot once in the forehead right between his eyes, Brenna displayed no sign of grief or even surprise. Instead, she shocked detectives by giving a list of grievances and complaints about her recently murdered husband. According to Brenna, she had initiated their recent separation by kicking Russell out of the house 7 months ago. She'd also filed a report with police alleging that he was verbally and physically abusive, that he threatened to punch her in the face, and had once, years ago, hit their son across his face. And even though Brenna had withdrawn that complaint, she insisted to investigators that the information she had given police at the time was true. Russell had been controlling, he had once called her fat, and he had cheated on her both with women and with men. Brenna also claimed that Russell had downloaded tons of pornography to his computer and that he liked using sex toys. As for their recent reconciliation, it had been his idea more than her idea for the 2 of them to try to get back together and fix their marriage. And even though they had had sex during their Christmas reunion, Brenna told detectives that she had only done that because she wanted to feel loved. Brenna also told police that Russell abused both alcohol and drugs, and if he had any friends at all, they were only the friends that she herself had made and introduced him to. Brenna's barrage of criticism about the father of her children and the man who was never late with child or spousal support and who showed up right away when Brenna needed help with a household project not only shocked the 2 detectives, it made them wonder if all that bitterness Brenna was expressing to them added up to a possible motive for Brenna to kill her husband. Sensing that the police had found her response surprising, Brenna wasted no time sketching out her own airtight alibi for December 26th, the day Russell was killed, from the moment he had kissed her and the children goodbye before leaving mid-morning to run some errands, right through the early afternoon of December 27th. As to why she had not contacted anyone when Russell did not come back to the house that afternoon or night, Brenna said she assumed he'd probably just blown her off again. But even as police verified Brenna's alibi, she remained a person of interest, especially when investigators found out that Russell had made Brenna the beneficiary of 2 life insurance policies. One of them was worth $200,000, and the other was worth close to $400,000. Those suspicions sharpened over the next couple of weeks when the interviews they conducted with Russell's family, his former lover Marge, and his co-workers at the land management company where he worked all painted a very different picture of Russell and suggested that maybe Brenna either had a distorted view of her husband, or she wasn't telling the truth, or that Russell was one of those people who turned into a totally different person when he was with his wife and kids. Because according to those other witnesses, Russell was a friendly, almost shy loner who had surprised his boss one day by wearing a kilt to work. But Russell came across in interviews as a smart and hardworking employee who took to heart his boss's request that Russell stick with more conventional wardrobe choices at work. Russell was definitely prone to depression, but his coworkers had never seen any sign that he was a drinker or that he even dabbled in drugs. Russell was excited about earning his master's in business administration. He obviously loved his kids. He talked a lot about the marital problems he and Brenna were having without ever bashing Brenna, but he also seemed very hopeful that they could save their marriage. And those close to both Russell and Brenna said the arguments between husband and wife were definitely two-sided, that Brenna had a short fuse and that her poor money management had led to her hair salon sinking into debt. If that was true, that Brenna was in serious debt, then Brenna would have a financial motive for getting rid of Russell and claiming the payout from his life insurance policies. Brenna had told detectives that she was not aware of Russell having any life insurance policies, but right after saying this to police, Brenna had contacted Russell's insurance companies and put in her claim as Russell's beneficiary. However, since Brenna was suspected in Russell's death, the insurance company would not allow her to collect any money. Instead, the insurance company sent investigators of their own out to speak with police about Brenna's possible involvement in Russell's death. And what Detective Plumberg found out in speaking with the insurance company's investigators was that Brenna had presented herself and Russell very differently to the insurance company than she had to police. To insurance investigators, she described Russell as a loving and supportive husband, and as a couple, they were committed to reconciliation after going through a minor rough patch in their marriage. At around the same time police were speaking with the insurance investigators, an examination of Russell's work computer and personal laptop were completed, and what police learned was that 1, Brenna had full access to her husband's email and bank accounts, and 2, Russell was not a big consumer of pornography like Brenna had said. After her initial interview with detectives on the night Russell's body was discovered, Brenna quickly hired a lawyer, she refused to take a lie detector test, and then she refused to answer any more questions unless the police could come up with hard evidence that would link Brenna to her husband's murder. And as suspicious as this made Brenna seem, the police didn't have any hard evidence connecting her to her husband's murder, and so for the time being, they had to leave her alone. However, that would change a few weeks later when police were able to examine Russell's phone records. And there was one number with an out-of-state area code that popped up a couple of times in the second half of December that did not fit the pattern of other calls to or from Russell's cell phone. And when Detective Plumberg called that number out in Las Vegas, Nevada, they found one of the things they'd been hoping for. Anyone who had a link to both the victim, Russell, and to their person of interest, his wife, Brenna. That person turned out to be none other than Peggy Sue Thomas, Brenna's best friend, who had moved off Whidbey Island back in 2000. That's when Peggy had gone to Las Vegas to compete in the Continental Mrs. USA pageant. Although Peggy Sue had won the evening gown competition and impressed judges with her stint in the Navy as an aircraft mechanic, she had not won the title. But during that competition, Peggy Sue had fallen in love with the bright lights and big city feels of Las Vegas. That's when she rented her house to Russell and Brenna and moved with her 2 daughters to Henderson, Nevada, just outside of Las Vegas, where Peggy now made a good living as a glamorous limousine driver with a loyal clientele of high rollers and big tippers. Peggy told detectives that she and her boyfriend had been out to Whidbey Island over the Christmas holiday, and that she, Peggy, had seen Russell at his apartment just outside of Seattle on December 23rd. But she had only seen him long enough to hand him a Christmas gift that was for his wife, Brenna. That's what the 3 phone calls that the police had seen in the phone records were about. Peggy had called Russell to arrange this gift exchange, but when he didn't answer that call, the two of them had kind of played phone tag for a little bit before they did connect and make their plans. As for Peggy Sue's boyfriend, Jim Hewden, he was also a native of Whidbey Island, but he'd left the island years ago after he had struck it rich selling a computer program he had designed to the computer giant Microsoft. And although Peggy Sue and Jim had spent Christmas together in Washington State, Jim had not come with her to see Russell on the night of the 23rd to deliver the package for Brenna. Peggy Sue admitted that most of what she knew about Russell was secondhand information she had gotten from his wife and her best friend, Brenna, and almost all of it was very negative about how terrible Russell was. However, Peggy Sue would tell police that during her brief visit with Russell on the 23rd, he was very nice and seemed happy and excited about spending Christmas with Brenna and the kids. By the time the call ended with Peggy Sue, Detective Plumberg had started to wonder if Russell's murder would ever be solved, because every lead they followed up on seemed to turn into a dead end. By June 2004, 5 months after Russell's murder, and with no fresh or promising leads, Detective Plumberg decided to go back and review the entire investigation. But it wouldn't be until the end of July, a full 7 months after Russell had been shot at point-blank range, that police would get the first of a string of tips that would eventually break the murder case wide open. And the first of those tips would come so far out of left field that at first, Detective Plumberg literally could not believe what he was hearing. On July 26th, the Island County Sheriff's Office picked up a call from a man who asked them if they had any information on an unsolved homicide that had happened around Christmas the year before, in 2003. When the detective who had answered the call replied that they did have such a case, the caller went quiet. After a few long seconds, the man told the investigator that he had information, but he was, quote, scared to talk about it. Over the next several days, this caller, who initially refused to give police his name or his location, would eventually give Island County detectives his own name, Bill Hill, and the name of a person who Bill said had first-hand knowledge of who killed Russell Douglas. After chasing down so many false leads and dead ends in this murder investigation, Detective Plumberg was very skeptical of this story. But as more and more details showed that Bill wasn't just getting his information from news stories, the detective got more and more interested. And by August 4th, 2004, just a week after Bill had made his first call to the Island County Sheriff's Office, Detective Plumberg and his commander were on a plane headed to Florida to talk with Bill's mysterious person of interest. At the same time, 2 other detectives were on a plane headed to Las Vegas to have another chat with Brenna's best friend, Peggy Sue Thomas. Once Detective Plumberg and his commander arrived in the small town of Punta Gorda on the southwest coast of Florida, they wasted no time following up on the tip they had received from Bill. Not only were they very eager to talk to this mystery witness, they were also eager to get back out of Florida before the big storm system that was forming out over the Caribbean Ocean just off the coast of Central America turned into a hurricane. But just a few hours after knocking on the door of this new person of interest, Detective Plumberg was once again feeling defeated and more confused than ever. Their mystery witness had been more than willing to talk with the detectives and had even gone with them to the local Punta Gorda police station for questioning. But they denied knowing anything about what happened to Russell and were flabbergasted when they were asked if they were involved in the murder. Their response to that question was, "Why would I do that? What possible motive could I have?" And in truth, Detective Plumberg was secretly thinking the same thing. It didn't make any sense. Plus, he knew that police had no hard evidence at all that could link anyone, including this new mystery person in Florida, to Russell's murder. An hour later, the interview was over, and Detective Plumberg's mystery witness had left the police station and returned home. The only good news for the Washington Island County detectives was that they'd still managed to fly out of Florida ahead of the storm. And they were lucky because by August 9th, just a few days after they had left, that storm had turned into a Category 4 hurricane that headed straight into Florida's southwestern coast and the town of Punta Gorda, where they had been. Meanwhile, the team of Island County detectives who had headed to Las Vegas had hit a similar dead end. In his conversation with Island County investigators, the caller, Bill Hill, had mentioned the name of a woman named Peggy, as well as the name of another woman, Brenna. Bill had told police that he'd heard both names mentioned in connection with Russell's murder. With Brenna no longer talking to investigators, Detective Plumberg had wanted his officers to speak again to Peggy Sue, and this time in person and on the record. But Peggy Sue said she had no information for County Island officers. She was also outraged at the sight of detectives showing up with a search warrant at her house in Henderson, Nevada. Peggy Sue watched as police searched everywhere in her house for any evidence that she had lied to police when she described her meeting with Russell on December 23rd at his apartment. And after the police could find no evidence, the very frustrated investigators began asking Peggy Sue about her boyfriend, Jim Huden, and his possible connection to Brenna or Russell Douglas. But it would turn out that not only had Jim never met Russell, Jim had left Peggy Sue in early February of 2003, 2 months after Russell's murder, and the couple had not parted on friendly terms. Jim had been married when Peggy Sue had met him on Whidbey Island in 2002, and even though he'd lived with Peggy in Las Vegas for several months, ultimately he decided to return to his wife and his small computer software business. That said, Peggy Sue could still account for their movements on the day Russell was killed, December 26, 2003. And she even managed to locate some old receipts from that day to show detectives exactly where they had gone on Whidbey Island before leaving Washington State late that night to return to Nevada. When detectives pressed Peggy Sue on having a financial motive for killing Russell, maybe she was going to split his life insurance policy with her good friend Brenna, Peggy pointed out that she already made a very comfortable living, so why would she do that? So, a few days later, Island County detectives came back from Nevada as empty-handed as Detective Plumberg had been when he came back from Florida. But 15 days later, on August 18, 2004, all of that would change. That was the day that the local Whidbey newspaper ran a news story based on unofficial sources that mentioned that former Whidbey Island residents Jim Huden and Peggy Sue Thomas were persons of interest in the ongoing investigation into Russell Douglas's murder. And on August 19th, 1 day later, yet another person who said they knew something about the case stepped forward. This time, it was a former police officer named Keith Ogden who lived in New Mexico. Keith, who had heard about the news story from a cousin who lived on Whidbey Island, would tell Island County investigators a story that put everything they had heard on their recent trips to Florida and Nevada in a whole new light. Because not only did Keith have the name of the likely murderer, he also had the weapon that was likely used to kill Russell Douglas. It was the .380 Bersa pistol, and ballistic tests would soon confirm that the markings on the shell casing found at the crime scene and the bullet that had been removed from the inside of Russell's skull exactly matched the grooves on the inside of that gun. The murder weapon, combined with the stories police now had from both Keith and their other informant, Bill Hill, finally allowed Detective Plumberg and his team of investigators to identify Russell's killer. Based on that information, here is a reconstruction of what happened to Russell Douglas on December 26, 2003. On that morning, Russell took special pleasure in the time he was spending with his family. Their Christmas celebration the day before had been everything he could have wished for. After arriving in Langley on Christmas Eve, Brenna had taken his car to the store and bought pies and other fixings for the Christmas dinner they planned to share the next day with Brenna's widowed stepfather. And except for Russell's gift of lingerie to Brenna, the other gifts he had brought for his family, especially the new Xbox video game console he'd bought for Jack, turned out to be nothing short of inspired. After Brenna's stepfather left at 5 or 6 p.m., Russell and Jack played Xbox while Brenna and Hannah watched a movie together. Once the kids were in bed, Russell was allowed into Brenna's room where they watched a movie together in bed and then fell asleep. And then on that morning, the 26th, he and Brenna made love. Now, having eaten breakfast with the kids, Russell was getting ready to go out and run a few errands. In fact, he had arranged a surprise for Brenna, one that he knew would make her happy. So, at about 10:45 or 11 a.m., Russell gave Jack, Hannah, and Brenna each a kiss and a hug before leaving the house and climbing into the driver's seat of his yellow Chevy Tracker. Whether anyone inside the house saw him or not, it felt good to wave at the house where his family lived before he pulled out onto Furman Ave and headed west toward Freeland. Russell's killer had chosen the time of their rendezvous very carefully. They had given Russell clear directions, and they also knew that Russell was very punctual, and if anything, he might arrive a little early. But the killer was in place and ready well before Russell arrived. The killer had only test-fired the Bersa pistol a few times, but at close range, they figured it would be nearly impossible to miss. Right on time, the killer heard the sound of an approaching car, and so before Russell pulled into the driveway, the killer stepped back into the shadows and waited. A moment later, Russell pulled his yellow Chevy Tracker into the long driveway that led to 6665 Wall Road. Now that he saw how out of the way this place was, he wondered why on earth they hadn't agreed to meet somewhere closer to Langley. Still, Russell had enjoyed the drive, and except for his wrong turn into that driveway up the road, he hadn't really had any trouble finding their meeting spot. Anyway, it would make a good story to tell Brenna, since she was the reason he was here in the first place. Almost as soon as Russell had pulled into that parking spot and turned off the car engine, he saw a figure in front of him step out of the woodline. With the sunglasses still on, it was hard to make out this person's face, but Russell figured it had to be the woman he was here to meet. How many other women were 6 feet tall on Whidbey Island? But before Russell could unbuckle his seatbelt and step out of the car to greet Peggy Sue, this person from the tree line had rushed over to his vehicle and stopped right outside of his car door, kind of blocking him from getting out. And so as they did that, Russell turned and looked at them and realized very quickly this person was not Peggy Sue. He didn't know who this person was. Instinctively, Russell just started to roll down his window to ask this person what they wanted. But as he was rolling the window down, Russell suddenly froze, because this stranger was now holding a pistol. And without ever saying a word, the stranger raised the pistol, aimed it at Russell's face, and pulled the trigger. As the bullet traveled through Russell's brain, his brain tissue stretched along the trajectory of the bullet, and when the tissue did tear, it snapped back into place with force so great that Russell's forehead suddenly bulged outward, and along with blood, the gray matter of Russell's brain began leaking in ropey strands out of the small hole centered right between his eyes. Before leaving, the killer opened the driver's side door of the tracker. They wanted to make sure Russell really was dead. By the time the police discovered Russell's body one day later, his body was stiff and cold to the touch. Even before the EMTs confirmed the cause of death, Detective Plumberg would describe the wound as a massive head trauma caused by an execution-style shooting that occurred from a distance of just 12 inches. It would turn out Russell's killer was Peggy Sue's boyfriend, Jim Huden. And it was Peggy Sue who had arranged the time and place where Russell would be murdered. Peggy Sue had in fact called Russell several times not long before Christmas to arrange a meeting so Peggy Sue could give Russell a Christmas present from her to Brenna. But Peggy Sue never then went to Russell's apartment in Renton on December 23rd to drop that present off. Instead, Peggy had told Russell on the subsequent phone calls to meet her on December 26th at 6665 Wall Road, and at this meeting, she would give him her present for Brenna. Peggy had chosen this location because it was already a very isolated spot, and the family who lived at 6665 Wall Road, the Black family, they'd be gone in Costa Rica, so there'd be no witnesses. And so on December 26th, when Russell arrived at the meeting spot, instead of Peggy Sue coming up to him, it was her boyfriend, Jim Huden, who would step out of the tree line, walk over to Russell's car, and then shoot Russell point blank in the face. It would turn out that during the 4 months that Jim and Peggy Sue had lived together in Las Vegas back in 2003, Peggy had spent a lot of time on the phone listening to Russell's wife, Brenna, complain about Russell. None of what Brenna had to say was new, but now Peggy Sue could share her friend's complaints with her new boyfriend, Jim. When Jim later confessed his crime to his good friend, Bill Hill, down in Florida, where Jim lived with his wife, Jean, Jim told his friend that he decided to kill Russell because Peggy had told him Russell was abusive to his wife and children. Jim said that he himself had had a violent stepfather, and killing Russell seemed both thrilling and like a kind of revenge killing for what Jim himself claimed to have suffered. Island County detectives in Washington had a different theory. They believed that Brenna may have offered to split the proceeds from Russell's life insurance if Peggy and Jim killed Russell. At that point in Peggy Sue's life, and Jim's life too, money had become a big problem. 7 months after hearing Jim's confession, Bill Hill's conscience finally got to him, and he contacted investigators in Whidbey and told them what he knew. But even though detectives then flew to Florida to question Jim, who was the so-called mystery witness, and Nevada to question Peggy Sue, it wasn't until Keith Ogden contacted police on August 18th and provided the murder weapon that police would have the physical evidence they needed to arrest Jim for murder. According to Keith, who had met Jim and Peggy in Nevada, Jim had approached Keith and asked him to hold on to a gun for him since Jim said he didn't want to keep it in a house with Peggy's kids. Keith agreed, but when Keith heard that Jim was a suspect in a homicide, he realized the gun Jim had given him could potentially be a murder weapon, and so that's why he had come forward. 4 months later, in December of 2004, almost a year to the day that Russell was killed, Detective Plumberg requested an arrest warrant be issued for Jim Huden. But it would take another 7 years before either Jim or Peggy Sue were actually arrested and charged for the murder of Russell Douglas. Shortly after being interviewed by investigators down in Florida in August of 2004, Jim, the mystery witness, had taken advantage of the chaos caused by Hurricane Charlie to flee over the border from the US into Mexico. It wasn't until Jim's wife, Jean, who got tired of sending money to her husband in Mexico, came forward that the police were finally able to track Jim down. And so on June 9th, 2011, Jim was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. While Jim had been on the run, Peggy Sue had gone on to marry and then divorce Alaskan oil millionaire Mark Allen. After 7 months of marriage to him, she had walked away with more than $1 million in money and assets. At the time of her arrest, 1 month after Jim's, on July 9th, 2011, Peggy Sue was living off the shore of New Mexico on a houseboat she had named Off the Hook. While Jim refused to implicate Peggy Sue in Russell's murder, Peggy Sue didn't waste a minute before she put the full blame for Russell's murder squarely on Jim's shoulders. 1 year after their arrests, on July 20th, 2012, 59-year-old Jim Huden was convicted of first-degree murder in the shooting death of Russell Douglas and sentenced to 80 years in prison at the Washington State Penitentiary. 6 months later, on January 26, 2013, 3 days before her murder trial was scheduled to begin, 47-year-old Peggy Sue Thomas Allen pled guilty to a lesser charge of first-degree criminal assistance involving first-degree murder. Peggy Sue was given the maximum sentence of 4 years in prison at Washington Corrections Center for Women. The presiding judge said he regretted the Washington state statute that limited him to imposing what he called a shockingly short sentence. Peggy Sue was released in 2016. Russell's wife, Brenna, who now goes by her maiden name, Brenna Haslam, has never faced any formal charges in her husband's murder, although Island County investigators have continued to treat her as a person of interest. In December of 2005, so 2 years after Russell's death, his insurance company agreed to release a payout of $400,000 from his life insurance policy to Brenna. Brenna used the money to buy a new car and a new house that she subsequently lost 1 year later when she stopped paying the mortgage. There is no hard evidence that Russell Douglas ever physically abused his wife or his children. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please offer to make the 5-star review buttons bid, but when doing so, spread a thin layer of sand between their sheets. Also, please subscribe to the MrBallen podcast on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, Google, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories we have posted on our main YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. We now have a registered 501c3 charitable organization called the MrBallen Foundation that makes it as easy as possible for you to join me, my family, and my team in supporting those whose lives have been most impacted by violent and heinous crimes. Monthly donors to the MrBallen Foundation Honor Them Society will receive free gifts and exclusive invites to special live events. But the real reward is helping to create a new ending to the story for victims of violent crime. Go to MrBallen.Foundation and click Get Involved to join the Honor Them Society today. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username is just @MrBallen, and I really do read the majority of my DMs. Lastly, we have some really cool merchandise, so head on over to shopmrballen.com to have a look. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. In March of 1990, a detective in Florida who was investigating a missing person case decided to search a forested area right off of a busy highway. This forest had been searched before, but this detective just had a hunch that something could still be in there. And so he stepped into the thick rows of trees and began walking deeper into the forest. After a while, he was so far inside that he couldn't hear the highway anymore. All he could hear was the buzzing of insects all around him. At some point, the area in front of him became so thick, he didn't know if he could physically get through it. But he decided he would try to push just a little bit further. And after only a few minutes, he reached a clearing, and there was something big in the middle of it. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast, because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, tonight, please read a bedtime story to the 5-star review button, and then tuck them gently into their beds and give them a kiss on their forehead, and then once they peacefully doze off to sleep, proceed to scream death metal music into their ears. Also, please subscribe to the MrBallen podcast wherever you listen to podcasts so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. When I first joined the military, I went through a really challenging training course. Like physically and mentally and emotionally, it was just brutal, and it was super long. It took 6 months. But we always got the weekends off. And I remember, even though I would be so exhausted on Friday nights when I got back to my apartment that I shared with my wife, I would still stay up till like 3 in the morning. And then the next day, Saturday night, I would just do it again. I wouldn't drink or party or anything. I would just crush endless pots of coffee and play video games. It was my little mental happy place that I needed in order to briefly escape from the reality of my miserable life, which did get a lot better after I graduated that course. But as much as I loved the Fridays and Saturdays during that course, I hated the Sunday nights more than anything. I would just lay in bed dreading how horrible the next day and the next week was going to be. It was terrible. Well, that feeling is not unique to going through a difficult military training course. It's a feeling we all deal with from time to time. It's called the Sunday Scaries. It's named that because most times you feel that dread about the next day or the next week on Sunday nights, because Mondays tend to be the worst day of the week. But the Sunday Scaries can hit you anytime for any reason. But now there is a way to make your Sunday Scaries disappear. And that's with Sunday Scaries Vitamin Boosted CBD Gummies. Just one Sunday Scaries sour gummy, because sour is my favorite kind, and I am chilled out, focused, and ready to take on whatever life throws my way. 2022 is all about self-love and taking better care of myself, so whether I need to take the edge off, calm my racing mind, sleep better, or just chill, Sunday Scaries CBD Gummies are the answer. Look, we all have the right to live scare-free. Let me save you with my 25% discount. Visit sundayscaries.com and use my promo code MrBallen for your discount. That's promo code MrBallen for 25% off at sundayscaries.com. Lorraine Hendricks waited until she was sure her daughter was asleep. Then, the 43-year-old mom opened her daughter's bedroom door as quietly as she could and peeked in on 7-year-old Catherine. No matter how busy or hectic Lorraine's day was, the sight of her sleeping daughter, her dark gold hair on the pillow, surrounded by picture books and stuffed animals, always gave Lorraine a sense of peace and contentment. It was just the beginning of March 1990. At this time of the year, it was already cold up in Connecticut, where Lorraine had been born, but here, in Lorraine's adopted home state of Florida, it was still mild and comfortable. The window in Catherine's room was open, and Lorraine could see the curtains move in the cool breeze. Lorraine knew she would never forget the terrible disappointment she had felt back in her early 30s when she had suffered a miscarriage. But that experience had also made the joy and gratitude she'd felt at the age of 38 when she became pregnant again all the more incredible. Even now, Catherine's birthday, still 4 months away, marked a milestone that felt as special to Lorraine as it was exciting for Catherine. In the glow from the hallway light overhead, Lorraine could see the dark line of Catherine's eyelashes and hear the gentle sound of her breathing. With a final whispered "good night," Lorraine pulled her daughter's door closed as quietly as she had opened it just a minute or two earlier. And as she did, Lorraine felt a pang of regret about her weekend plans. It was Saturday evening, March 3rd, and tomorrow, Lorraine would begin a 7-hour road trip south from her home here in Jacksonville to Fort Lauderdale. That was the big drawback to traveling. Lorraine would miss putting Catherine to bed tomorrow night, and she would probably be driving into the evening on Monday night as well. Then again, Lorraine thought, she'd been lucky. Starting right after Catherine was born, and with the support of her husband Rick, Lorraine had been able to take a 6-year break from her own work in public relations and marketing so she could stay home with Catherine until their daughter was old enough to start school. And during those years, Lorraine had been able to teach Catherine to speak not only English, but a smattering of French and Spanish, as well as fluent Polish, the language that Lorraine herself had learned from her parents, Frank and Jody Dombrowski. Having a baby had also added to Lorraine's pleasure in physical activity. A natural athlete, Lorraine had always welcomed any and every physical challenge that she could find, from mountain climbing to skydiving to motorcycle racing to the black belt in karate she had earned when she was in her 20s. It wasn't long after giving birth that Lorraine was back to running, not only to get fit, but so she could run races again and even marathons. Except now, Catherine was with Lorraine in a stroller or caught up in her mother's arms towards the end of a race to be carried, laughing, across the finish line. Not that life was perfect. Lorraine gave a little sigh as she thought of Catherine's father. After 11 years of marriage, Lorraine and her husband Rick were just weeks away from finalizing their divorce. In fact, one of the reasons for Lorraine's trip south the next day was to arrange for the sale of their condominium located in the Fort Lauderdale suburb where they lived before Rick had gotten his current job up here in Jacksonville 2 years earlier. But the divorce had been as friendly as their marriage had been. It was just that over time, the two of them, who had married only 6 weeks after meeting each other, had grown apart. And since their separation, Rick had met someone new, and so had Lorraine. The thought of this new man in her life made Lorraine smile. Since opening her own public relations firm a year ago, she'd landed some very big accounts and had made a name for herself. In the past 12 months, she'd helped organize and market some high-profile conventions, festivals, and corporate events, and arranged entertainment with celebrities like Frankie Avalon and Joan Rivers and the Smothers Brothers. And in the course of that work, Lorraine had met the man, also in the entertainment industry, who she believed would one day become her husband and Catherine's stepdad. Except this time, Lorraine was moving slowly. Neither of them felt any need to rush, and right now, they were just enjoying whatever time together they could carve out of their busy schedules. Not that either love or business would squeeze out the other activities in Lorraine's life and in the life she wanted to build for her daughter. Lorraine had always followed her own mother's example, taking time to give back to her community. And Lorraine, also a devout Catholic like her mother, had done just that. Whether it was teaching Spanish language classes at church, or the time she'd spent years ago running self-defense courses for women, or rescuing stray or abused animals. Above all, Lorraine was a people person. Confident and curious, she was a good judge of her fellow human beings, and whenever possible, if she was faced with a difficult situation or conflict, she tried to find common ground, without ever sacrificing her own strong code of morals and ethics. A moment later, and Lorraine had walked the short distance from Catherine's bedroom to her own. Her parents would be here first thing tomorrow, and right now, Lorraine needed to pack an overnight bag for her trip to Fort Lauderdale. At 8 a.m. the next morning, Lorraine was ready to go. As soon as she had showered, she slipped into a pair of faded jeans, a reddish-brown top, and comfortable moccasin-style shoes. Lorraine didn't bother with makeup. Not only was she a natural athlete, she was also a natural beauty. 5 foot 6 inches tall and slim as well as fit, Lorraine looked much younger than 43. Although her thick, once blonde hair had darkened years ago to a shining chestnut, it was easy to see why she had won the Miss Stamford, Connecticut beauty pageant back in 1967 and later did some work as a model. Lorraine quickly ran a brush through her damp hair, then headed downstairs to have a quick breakfast with Catherine and her own mom and dad before leaving. As she walked down the stairs, Lorraine smiled. She could already hear Catherine chattering to Lorraine's mom in Polish. After breakfast, Lorraine kissed her mom and Catherine, and they said their goodbyes. She reminded her parents that her soon-to-be ex-husband Rick would be there at 11 a.m. to take Catherine down to his own apartment, where she would stay until Lorraine got back on Monday. Then Lorraine and her dad carried her bags out to Lorraine's gray 4-door Honda Accord, and Major Dombrowski, Lorraine's father was an officer in the Army, gave his daughter a quick hug. She promised she would call at her first stop for gas. The fuel gauge in her car was broken, and she didn't want anyone worrying that she would run out of fuel. After slipping into the driver's seat, Lorraine started the car and glanced over at the passenger seat just to make sure she had her headphones handy and her tape deck cued up to her favorite music. A moment later, Lorraine was backing out of the driveway. As she turned onto the residential street where she lived, she blew one last kiss to the tight group of 3 people, her parents and little Catherine, who stood waving at her from the doorway. As Lorraine headed into Jacksonville to pick up Interstate 95 that would take her all the way to Fort Lauderdale, she settled in to enjoy the familiar and scenic ride along the east coast of Florida. And at 10 a.m., true to her word, after 2 hours of driving, Lorraine pulled off I-95 and stopped at a gas station to refuel. Then, parking close to a nearby payphone, Lorraine got out to call her parents and chat for a minute with Catherine. Lorraine told her dad, who had answered the phone, that she was making good progress and she'd call again later when she got to Fort Lauderdale. About 1 hour later, Lorraine was traveling through Indian River County, one of those especially beautiful stretches of Florida that lives up to the name of its location along Florida's so-called Treasure Coast. Even though Lorraine had made this drive many times, she was still struck by the natural wonders all around her. On her way back, she'd be driving alongside the Indian River and the Pelican Island National Refuge. But even traveling southbound on the inland side of the interstate, there was plenty to see, especially since she seemed to have this particular stretch of the highway all to herself. After rounding a slight bend in the road, Lorraine noted the thick palmetto and pine trees that crowded the inside of the wide median strip on her left, and it was also at that moment that Lorraine suddenly became aware of the fact that she wasn't alone on I-95 after all. 4 days later, on March 8th, 36-year-old detective Phil Williams was standing in his now usual place, directly on top of a big red X that had been spray painted onto the shoulder of I-95 near Vero Beach in Indian River County, Florida. It had been 3 days since March 5th when the Florida Highway Patrol and Florida law enforcement had received a missing person report for Jacksonville resident Lorraine Hendricks. The stark words of the bulletin ran through Detective Williams' mind on an endless loop. Missing adult, endangered, good mental condition, foul play suspected. The first sign that something had happened to Lorraine was her failure to meet up with her realtor early on the afternoon of Sunday, March 4th in Plantation, a suburb of Fort Lauderdale and the location of the condo that Lorraine and her soon-to-be ex-husband owned and that Lorraine was about to put up on the market. By late on that afternoon of March 4th, the phone lines up and down the Florida coast and to every Florida patrol officer's headquarters between Jacksonville and Fort Lauderdale had started humming with frantic calls as Lorraine's family began to realize with growing panic that Lorraine seemed to have disappeared into thin air. The last anyone had ever heard from the 43-year-old mom and businesswoman was at about 10 a.m. on the morning she left Jacksonville, when she called her parents from a payphone at a gas station just 57 miles north of where Detective Williams now stood. It hadn't taken long to locate Lorraine's car. They found it even before the missing person report went out to all law enforcement. At noon on Monday, March 5th, highway officer Mike Transu, who patrolled that stretch of I-95, had already called into Vero Beach headquarters to report a 1982 gray four-door Honda Accord parked and apparently abandoned on the shoulder of I-95 southbound in Indian River County. There was no sign of the driver or any car keys, but when officers ran the plates, they discovered that the car was registered to Lorraine Hendricks. Once the car was towed to a police lot where it was searched and fingerprinted, police painted a large red X on the shoulder of the road where they had found Lorraine's car. In the 4 days since that discovery, Detective Williams had not wasted a minute. He had interviewed Lorraine's father and her soon-to-be ex-husband, who had both driven down to Vero Beach as soon as they heard that Lorraine's car had been found. With their help, investigators had put together a list of Lorraine's friends and business associates, as well as the name of the new man in Lorraine's life. The only item that appeared to be missing from the car was Lorraine's wallet, with her driver's license and her car keys. Investigators also pulled all the traffic tickets, warnings, and arrests that had been made along I-95 in the days before, during, and after Lorraine's disappearance in hopes that law enforcement had encountered either Lorraine or anyone remotely suspicious who might have been involved in her disappearance. Detective Williams and his officers had done foot searches of both the shoulder and the median strip where Lorraine's car had been found, looking for any clue, from a scrap of paper she might have dropped to an article of clothing or jewelry, but so far, nothing. It turned out the gray Honda she was driving had plenty of gas and no mechanical problems that might have led to a roadside breakdown. There was no evidence that Lorraine had picked up a hitchhiker. There was no sign that her car plates had been run through any law enforcement system database on either Sunday, March 4th or Monday, March 5th when her car was discovered. Lorraine's new boyfriend had left the day before Lorraine's trip south to spend a week in Europe on business. And Lorraine's soon-to-be husband had been up in Jacksonville with their daughter when Lorraine disappeared. But even though their foot searches of the area hadn't turned anything up either, Detective Williams kept finding himself returning again and again to the red X on the side of the road where Lorraine's Honda had been found. He was standing there now on the warm, windy, and very humid afternoon of Thursday, March 8th, staring in frustration at the densely wooded median strip about a mile away that separated this southbound stretch of I-95 from the northbound lane. Earlier that day, Detective Williams had ordered another intensive search of that area, first with helicopters and then with a large team of all area law enforcement who had done a step-by-step search of the whole 3-mile-long, 300-yard-wide stretch of grass and pine and palmetto trees. But the helicopters had peeled away with nothing to report. From the sky, it was almost impossible to see through the thick canopy of trees, and law enforcement officers on the ground had emerged from their foot search sweaty, bug-bitten, and empty-handed as well. But Detective Williams still wasn't satisfied. He was developing a theory that Lorraine must have been the victim of a random sex crime, that someone had been able to lure her out of her car, maybe pretending to have car trouble and flagging her down to help, and it looked to the veteran detective that the median strip with the big forest was the most likely place to commit a rape and then maybe a murder. Before going back to headquarters, he decided that he'd make one more foot search of the median forest himself. But before crossing the interstate to join his partner, Larry Smetzer, Detective Williams was joined by the 2 patrol officers who worked this stretch of I-95, Mike Transu, who had found Lorraine's car 4 days earlier, and Tim Harris, a canine officer whose highly trained German Shepherd was sitting at attention in Tim's nearby cruiser. Detective Williams knew from the hours he'd spent looking at recent traffic tickets that Tim had been processing an arrest at the time of Lorraine's suspected disappearance. But he still asked both officers if there was anything new they might have remembered about their Sunday, March 4th shifts along this stretch of road. Both officers shook their heads, but Tim offered to use his dog, Shadow, to help with the foot search of the forest median later that evening when the wind had settled so any scent would be close to the ground. But Detective Williams, who was a stocky man with a mustache and an easy manner, decided he did not want to wait that long, and so after the 2 police officers had left, He and his partner, Detective Smetzer, found themselves wading into the thickest and darkest part of the median forest, where they decided to split up so they could search in two different directions. Even though they were actually close to one of the most heavily used interstates in the country, as Detective Williams worked his way into a stand of pine and palmetto trees, it was like he'd entered a different world. Despite the Florida sun, it was dark in there, and the sound from the road was so muffled that all he could hear was the nearby buzzing of insects. The only thing that seemed to penetrate the wooded area was the wind, and the detective wondered if Officer Tim Harris might have been right. Even a well-trained dog might not be able to pick up a scent. But then Detective Williams felt a shiver of unease as he pushed even deeper into the stand of pine, and that's when he smelled it, a very faint odor of decomposition. Peering ahead in the gloom, he could just make out a slight mound of dead grass and pine needles leading right up to the trunk of a twisted pine tree. And at the end of the mound nearest to him, Detective Williams could also just make out what looked like a wig made of brown hair. Except it wasn't a wig. It was Lorraine Hendrick's actual hair. It would turn out that sometime during the 4 days since Lorraine had been murdered inside of that median forest, some small animal had peeled away her scalp and dragged it about 3 feet away from where the rest of her body now lay, nude, violated, strangled, and beaten under that pile of vegetation. A minute later, and Detective Williams had stumbled back out of the stand of trees into the narrow cut-through that highway troopers sometimes used to make a U-turn through the median strip. Meeting up with his fellow investigator who had been drawn back from his own search by the sound of shouting and breaking sticks, Detective Williams told his partner, "We can call off the search. She's in there, and she's dead." Today's podcast is sponsored by BetterHelp. After getting out of the military in 2017, I became depressed. I wound up seeking out therapy though, and it truly changed my life. But what I don't often highlight on here is the fact that I still see a therapist now despite not feeling depressed anymore. Because I've learned firsthand that the best way to handle your mental health is to treat it the same way you treat your physical health. You gotta just stay on top of it all the time. That way, when you start to struggle, you already have rapport with someone who can help. Also, I've found having a therapist to talk to is a great way to just solve life problems. Therapists are able to offer perspective that friends and family just can't. And many times, it's that perspective that allows you to fix whatever's going on in your life. So, if you're interested in making your mental health a priority like I have, consider giving BetterHelp a try. BetterHelp is a highly reviewed online therapy platform, and so that means it's super convenient, it's accessible, and it's affordable. BetterHelp can get you matched with a therapist after filling out a brief survey, and if that match doesn't work out, it's completely free to switch therapists at any time. When you want to be a better problem solver, therapy can get you there. Visit betterhelp.com/MrBallenPod today to get 10% off your first month. That's betterhelp.com/MrBallenPod. I don't know if you guys know this, but back before I was MrBallen, I was actually a 4-time world champion dingo kickboxer. Now, dingoes may not sound like much of an opponent, but I had to get 7 eye transplants during my 11-month career and nearly died every time I hopped in the ring, all without ever having a life insurance policy in place. I just assumed that since my profession was so high risk, no one would ever consider covering me. And to be honest, the whole life insurance process also intimidated me more than going toe to paw with a dingo. It wasn't until my last fight, when I nearly lost my foot from my roundhouse knockout kick to win my 4th title, that I started to reevaluate my career and wanted to take the first steps towards finding quality life insurance coverage. And that's when I found Policy Genius. Policy Genius is an insurance marketplace that makes it easy to compare quotes from top companies like AIG and Prudential in one place to find your lowest price on life insurance. You could save 50% or more on life insurance by comparing quotes with Policy Genius. Options start at just $17 per month for $500,000 of coverage. Just click the link in the description or head to policygenius.com/MrBallen to get personalized quotes in minutes and find the right policy for your needs. The licensed agents at Policy Genius work for you, not the insurance companies. They're on hand throughout the entire process to help you understand your options so you can make decisions with confidence. Policy Genius never adds on extra fees, and all of your personal info is private. Policy Genius will never sell your details to pesky third parties. Head to policygenius.com/MrBallen to get your free insurance quotes and see how much you could save. By 1:15 p.m. on Thursday, March 8th, the median strip on that stretch of I-95 through Indian River County was crowded with law enforcement and medical personnel. The area around Lorraine Hendrick's badly decomposed body was cordoned with yellow crime scene tape. Except for a single gold hoop earring found near her body, police found no trace of Lorraine's wallet or any of her clothing. By 7 p.m. that night, the Vero Beach medical examiner was conducting Lorraine's autopsy. Time of death was likely Sunday, March 4th, just a few hours after Lorraine had waved goodbye to her parents and Catherine before setting off on what should have been a routine trip to Fort Lauderdale. The next day, newspapers across Florida headlined the story, "Missing Jacksonville Woman Found Murdered." And not only did Detective Williams start receiving hundreds of tips from the public, but he also started hearing about how women all over Indian River County were now deeply scared. One of those women was 27-year-old Sandy Wessendorf, the mother of 2 young children who lived in an isolated area just 10 miles north of Vero Beach and not far from the site of Lorraine's murder. Except that Sandy had actually been feeling scared for a long time. Back in November of 1989, almost 4 months before seeing the headline about Lorraine's murder, Sandy had finally decided it was time to file for a divorce. Bright, beautiful, and completely inexperienced when it came to sex and relationships, Sandy had met her future husband when she was just 16 and he was 21. Although now, looking back to that time, if Sandy was truly honest with herself, she would have to admit that there had been problems right from the start. He had been unfaithful and unreliable, he flirted with her friends, he called her names like slut and bitch, and her mother, who was very close to Sandy and to Sandy's 2 other sisters and 1 brother, just never liked her son-in-law. And that was one big reason why Sandy had kept her marital problems very much to herself. Unlike her mother, Sandy had been sure when she got married at the age of 18 that all those problems would just go away. Because when she did break up with him a year before their marriage, when it turned out he had a second serious girlfriend who also expected to marry him, he had done everything he could to win Sandy back. And as always, Sandy had just found him too charming and handsome to resist. Despite her own popularity and good looks, Sandy was 5 foot 4 inches tall, slim and fit, with long blonde hair and green eyes. Sandy had never been with another man before falling in love with her husband. So it took her a while to realize that the physical ways in which he controlled her were not necessarily common or normal. There were the sharp pinches on the insides of her arms and her thighs where no one would see the bruises. There was the way he twisted her arm behind her back, and lately, how he had put his hands around her throat and told her, quote, "I could snap your neck and kill you right now." The last straw had been Sandy's birthday celebration. He'd planned dinner out for the 2 of them on September 29th, exactly 1 week before her actual birthday. Sandy had been excited. They hardly ever went out, especially since their first child had been born back in 1983. Sandy still remembered that event. After she had gone into labor and asked her husband to take her to the hospital, he had refused to drop her off at the door of the hospital. Instead, annoyed that she had gotten him up so early in the morning, he had insisted on parking in the visitor's lot. After watching her struggle out of the car, he'd told her, quote, "You're gonna walk, bitch." Their second child had been born 2 years later. But still, Sandy had been excited about the birthday dinner, and the children were excited about spending the evening with other family members. But literally, right after Sandy and her husband had gotten to the restaurant and their food had arrived, Sandy's husband looked up from his plate, stopped mid-chew, and announced that he was seeing another woman. Then he motioned to Sandy's own plate and told her to start eating or her dinner would get cold. It would turn out that her husband had not just started having an affair. He'd been involved with this woman for the last 4 years, and Sandy had had no idea. Although looking back, all the signs had been there. The affair had started when Sandy was pregnant the second time, and her husband always had things to do and places to be that took him away from home. But Sandy had truly believed that whatever their issues, both she and her husband had been absolutely faithful to each other. In fact, to Sandy, that was the one thing keeping their marriage together. Sandy had put up with her husband's abuse because she really did believe that deep down, they must be each other's soulmates. But now, she had no reason to believe that, and she knew she had to end the marriage. But what Sandy hadn't expected was her husband's reaction to her decision to file for a divorce. He had no intention of giving up his other woman, but there was no way he was going to give up Sandy either. After that, things had gone from bad to worse. On Valentine's Day, 1989, she found out just how obsessive her husband had become. When she had gone to her bookkeeping job that day, she discovered her boss waiting for her. With a grim look on his face, he told her that someone she knew must have broken into their office where they kept sensitive financial information and gestured to the inside of the small room where she worked. When Sandy looked through the door, she knew immediately that her husband must have made copies of her work keys and used them to enter the building the night before. The space in front of her was crammed with white and red balloons. Bursting into tears, Sandy had turned around and gone straight home, knowing that she'd be lucky just to keep her job, and she couldn't afford to lose that job. Her husband could never seem to possess enough things. Cars, trucks, boats. He'd even talked about getting his own helicopter. If Sandy hadn't been so good at managing money and juggling more than one job, they would have lost their house a long time ago. And right after Sandy had walked through the door of that house on the afternoon of the balloon incident, she came face to face with her surprised husband. Rushing past him, she locked herself in the bathroom, and it was then that she saw the tape recorder he had left sitting on the bathroom counter. When she hit the play button, she realized with shock that he had been recording her incoming and outgoing phone calls. When Sandy eventually stepped out of the bathroom carrying the tape recorder, her husband's face was a twisted mask of rage. After that, Sandy found other tape recorders that he had left around the house, one in her bedroom and another hidden in the creases of the living room sofa. Now, not even a month later, Sandy didn't even bother to remove these recording devices. If she did, she knew he'd just find some other way to invade every private space in her life. As darkness fell over Sandy's house in Citrus Hideaway and her 2 kids slept upstairs, Sandy sat listening in her kitchen. And as she expected, it wasn't long before she heard the soft thump as her husband, who had been kicked out of the house, stepped carefully through the window of their son's upstairs bedroom. For weeks now, he'd been climbing from a low-hanging porch roof up onto the second story and then into their upstairs. Sandy didn't even bother to call out and tell him she knew he was up there and that she knew he'd been spending the night in that room for weeks, because it wouldn't have done any good anyway. Following the discovery of Lorraine's body, Detective Williams and his team tracked down dozens of tips and possible leads in the murder case. There was the man in a yellow Oldsmobile who seemed to be following a female driver off of an I-95 exit. There was a woman who reported that a man had tried to force her car off of I-95 and then had shot out her car window before speeding away. One man who contacted the police telling them to be on the lookout for someone who trolled I-95 for stranded female motorists turned out himself to have had a prior conviction for rape, a set of handcuffs in his glove compartment, and a rock-solid alibi. But despite spending hundreds of staff hours on this case, the only physical evidence they'd turned up that was in any way related to Lorraine's killing was on March 9th, when Vero Beach police were contacted by police 1 county over with a report that Lorraine's wallet, that was missing the driver's license, had been discovered in a rest area dumpster 20 miles south of where Lorraine's car had been found. The wallet had actually been recovered before Lorraine's body had been found and ID'd, so police had not recognized its significance right away. But any hope that the wallet could help ID the killer was short-lived. Whoever had dumped it at the rest area had also wiped it completely clean of fingerprints. Even as investigators and law enforcement from the police, sheriff's department, and the Florida Highway Patrol joined forces to move the investigation along, Detective Williams was also looking for any information on recent homicides that looked at all similar to Lorraine's murder and suspected rape. But despite his best efforts, he just could not catch a break in this case. On March 21st, 13 days after discovering Lorraine's body, the detective was once again poring over all the tickets, warnings, and other records of police activity in the area on March 4th and 5th, the day that Lorraine had been driving and the day that her car had been discovered. It was during this second review that Detective Williams noticed a detail that he had overlooked the first time around. Staring down at the piece of paper on his desk, Detective Williams picked up the phone and made a quick call that would correct his earlier mistake. After hanging up the phone, he slid that particular piece of paper out of the pile. What he had just found out didn't necessarily change anything, but it might be worth following up on later. Meanwhile, in the white stucco house on its lonely acre in Citrus Hideaway, things for Sandy were only getting worse. Her continuing refusal to withdraw the notice for divorce that she had filed in late November had made her husband more and more angry. At about 9 p.m. on Sunday, March 25th, when Sandy was sitting in the living room of her house talking with two of her visiting neighbors, she heard the familiar thump of her estranged husband landing on the floor upstairs in their son's bedroom. This time, Sandy jumped up and ran upstairs to confront him and told him that if he was going to come into the house, then he should come downstairs because their neighbors knew he was there. A few minutes later, he was sitting in the living room, but was refusing to say a single word until the neighbors left, which they ultimately would. But as soon as the door closed behind the neighbors, Sandy's husband exploded into action. 10 inches taller and 70 pounds heavier than his terrified wife, he grabbed Sandy and dragged her across the room and up the stairs into the master bedroom where he had stashed a black vinyl bag. Reaching in through the open zipper, he pulled out a pair of handcuffs and then turned out the light. Before Sandy could grasp what was happening, he snapped one of the cuffs around her wrist. The click of the lock sent a rush of adrenaline coursing through Sandy's body, and before he could snap the other cuff onto her other wrist, she kicked out her legs from under her and brought both of them falling to the floor. Their 10-minute struggle ended as her husband knew it would, with him gaining control over her. Sandy had managed to keep her husband from putting the other cuff on her other wrist, but when he couldn't cuff her, he had just given up the idea and climbed directly onto her chest, pinning her down with one leg on either side of her. And with her under him, unable to move, he had reached into his black bag and pulled out a gun and pointed it at the side of her head. And then clenching his other hand into a fist, he started beating the carpet right next to the other side of her face. Then he stopped and said, "You are going to take me back." But Sandy, in an act of defiance, shook her head, no. Furious, her husband began hitting the floor next to her head even harder and told her with a menacing look that he was going to do this to her face if she didn't do what he said. And it was at that point that Sandy knew she was not just facing rape or injury, she was facing death. Her husband was going to kill her if she didn't agree to take him back. And so Sandy, who could barely breathe with the weight of her husband on top of her, told herself to stay calm, and then she said, "Okay, I'll take you back." And then, in a rush, she continued in a quiet and soothing voice, telling him that tomorrow they would have a little ceremony, just the two of them, and they would put their wedding rings back on and renew their marriage vows, and he could let her get up now and take off the handcuff and go back downstairs so they wouldn't scare the kids, and so she could get a drink of water. A few minutes later, they were sitting together in the living room. Sandy tried to keep her hands from shaking as she drank the glass of water he had handed her. She could already feel the swelling around her wrist from where the metal handcuff had been. Suddenly, her husband stood up from his seat on the sofa. Without saying a word, he started to pull off his shirt and then unzip his corduroy jeans. Sandy turned her head away, feeling her whole body tense in fear and revulsion at the sound of that zipper. But when she looked back at her husband, the air suddenly seemed to be sucked out of her lungs, because the man staring back at her with dark, hungry eyes was wearing a pair of women's tan pantyhose and women's black lace underwear with a sheer panel in front. 2 days later, on March 26th, Detective Williams got several new pieces of information that would eventually break the stalled investigation into the murder of Lorraine Hendricks wide open. Sitting at his desk that Monday morning, the detective pulled out that piece of paper he had set aside 5 days earlier. It was a traffic ticket about a warning someone had been given. He read the information on it again and tracked down the phone number of the driver who had been given the warning on the morning of Sunday, March 4th, while driving over the speed limit on I-95 through Indian River County. Then he picked up the phone and placed a call. Later that same day, Detective Williams got a report about a domestic violence complaint that had been filed the day before at the nearby Sebastian Police Headquarters. That evening, Detective Williams picked up the phone and made several more calls. One of them was to a terrified young woman named Sandy Wessendorf, who agreed to meet with him the next day, Tuesday, March 27th, in the parking lot of a nearby high school. Based on those phone calls, the meeting with Sandy, the medical examiner's report, and the eventual confession of Lorraine's murderer, here is a reconstruction of what police believe probably happened to Lorraine Hendricks on the day she was killed. Back on Sunday, March 4th, Lorraine was making good time as she headed down I-95 from Jacksonville to Fort Lauderdale. Only 2 hours into her 7-hour trip, she almost hated to stop, but she knew her parents would appreciate the call. And she was looking forward to talking with her daughter, Catherine, before Rick arrived at 11 a.m. and took her back to his apartment. So, at about 10 a.m., Lorraine pulled off the interstate at an Amoco gas station, topped off her fuel tank, then went to the ladies' room, and then used the nearby payphone to call home. When she pulled back onto I-95 South a few minutes later, Lorraine was smiling as she thought of how excited Catherine was to be spending the morning with her grandparents. And this next part of her trip through Indian River County was especially beautiful. So Lorraine put on her headphones and she bumped the volume up on her music, and she settled in for a long stretch of driving. About an hour or so later, Lorraine was driving around a slight curve on I-95 with a thickly wooded median on her left. She was just thinking about how empty the road was when, out of nowhere, she saw a police cruiser appear in her rearview mirror. Instantly, her eyes dropped to the dashboard, and she was relieved to see that she was driving roughly the speed limit. But when she glanced in her rearview mirror again, she was surprised to see that the highway trooper had his lights on and was clearly waiting for her to pull over onto the shoulder. This wouldn't be the first time that Lorraine, who was often teased for driving too fast, had been stopped by police. But she was calm. As the daughter of an Army major, she had been raised to be both respectful and professional when it came to officers in uniform. So even though she wasn't sure why she had been stopped, she parked her car on the side of the road, she took off her headphones, and by the time the highway patrol officer had reached her window, she had taken out both her driver's license and her car's registration. But almost as soon as she looked up at the tall, muscular officer in his beige Stetson hat, Lorraine felt a sense of alarm. He seemed agitated, and when he leaned down to look through her window, she felt his eyes crawling all over her. Later, when he had forced her into his cruiser and driven into the cut-through of the median strip, Lorraine still thought she could save herself. But the German Shepherd in the back of the cruiser was terrifying, with its low growl and bared teeth. And when the man had dragged her out of the cruiser, slamming the car door behind her, her relief at being away from the dog instantly changed to a different kind of fear. Even with her now rusty skills in self-defense, Lorraine was completely off balance, and before she could even react, her attacker was dragging her deep into the thickest part of the median strip forest, into a stand of pine and palmetto trees with a canopy of branches and leaves that was so thick even the bright Florida sun was blotted out. And now the man was talking to her like she was someone else, his wife, a woman he called Sandy, who apparently was threatening to divorce him. But he would never let that happen. Undoing his belt and unzipping his pants, he shoved Lorraine down on the ground. Even as Lorraine tried to talk to him, to tell him she understood he was hurting, that she was not the person he thought she wasn't Sandy. He yanked her pants down and pulled her shirt and bra up over her chest, and then straddling her, he pinned her arms to her sides. When he was finished, he turned Lorraine over one more time so her battered face was pressed into the ground. Then he placed her underwear around her neck and pulled it tight. But it was the heavy force of his hands pressing down on her and breaking her slender neck that would finally kill her. When Lorraine was dead, 32-year-old Highway Patrol Officer Tim Harris, the same Tim Harris who had offered to have his dog search the median forest for Detective Williams, stripped off the rest of Lorraine's clothes and dragged her injured body even deeper into the trees. Then he arranged Lorraine's body so she lay face down with her legs spread out around either side of a tree trunk in a sexually suggestive position. Gathering her clothes and every possible piece of evidence of the crime he had just committed, Tim covered Lorraine's body with dead grass and leaves and then returned to his police cruiser. He would toss Lorraine's wallet at a rest area 20 miles south. The only thing Tim missed taking with him was the gold hoop earring that police would later find not far from Lorraine's badly decomposed body. It would turn out that on March 21st, when Detective Williams was reviewing the records of tickets, warnings, and arrests that had been issued on March 4th, he realized that Highway Patrol Officer Tim Harris was not the officer who had been processing an arrest that Sunday morning at about 11:30 a.m. Instead, it had been Officer Mike Transu who had been processing that arrest, using a serial number that had only recently been transferred from Tim to Mike, which meant that Tim Harris did not have an alibi for the morning of Lorraine's murder. With that in mind, Detective Williams took a second look at a warning that had also been issued that morning to a motorist at 10:48 a.m. Now that he knew Tim Harris's new serial number, the detective realized that that warning had been issued by Tim Harris. When Detective Williams called the driver who got this warning, he spoke to a young woman who insisted that she had not been speeding when she was pulled over at almost the exact same location where Lorraine's car had been found the next day. The driver also said that the highway patrol officer who stopped her had also told her to get out of her car and walk backwards towards his vehicle. Since the driver was almost 8 months pregnant, the request, which seemed totally unnecessary and even creepy to start with, was also totally inconvenient. But once the patrol officer noticed how pregnant the woman was, he immediately seemed to lose interest in her and in his accusation that she had been speeding. When he handed her the warning he had written out, he even told her, "Oh, you can just throw that away. It doesn't mean anything." As Detective Williams considered this new information, he thought again about that stretch of I-95 and how an officer parked near that curve in the road would be able to look directly through the windshield of oncoming cars and spot women who were driving alone. Detective Williams believed that the woman who got the warning at 10:48 a.m. was only saved because of her advanced pregnancy, that was a turnoff to Tim Harris. And then after the pregnant woman had gotten back in her car and left, the next solo woman driving around that curve was Lorraine Hendricks, and she would not be so lucky. Digging deep into Tim's employment records, investigators would later find that he had been forced to resign from his first job with a tiny police force in Melbourne, Florida, after complaints that he sometimes refused to give women their licenses back, forcing them to come to the station later to meet alone with him. It was also rumored that he would offer to tear up a ticket or traffic violation in exchange for sex. But it wasn't until March 26th, when Detective Williams saw the charge of domestic assault that Tim's estranged wife, Sandy, had filed against her husband, that the investigator felt he had the leverage he needed to press Tim about his possible involvement in Lorraine's murder. On March 27th, Detective Williams met with Sandy, whose maiden name was Wessendorf, in the high school parking lot. After Tim's attack on her 2 nights earlier, she had taken her 2 kids to her sister and brother-in-law's house for protection. After Tim had stripped off his clothes to reveal the women's lingerie he was wearing, Sandy had somehow been able to persuade him that they should wait to have sex until the next day after they renewed their wedding vows. Sandy's brother-in-law, who was also a police officer, had told Sandy that she had to go to the police and that he would protect her. So the next day, on March 26th, Sandy, with her brother-in-law, Don Dappin, at her side, filed an assault charge and restraining order against Tim Harris. Don Dappin then made sure that Detective Williams and Tim's commanding officer were both aware of the domestic violence charge, and then Don himself provided around-the-clock protection for Sandy and her kids. Sandy would later locate the lingerie her husband had been wearing, and she would give it to police. But although Lorraine Hendricks sometimes wore a similar style of underwear, police did not find any physical evidence that that lingerie actually belonged to her. On April 7, 1990, almost 1 month to the day that Lorraine's body was found in the median strip along I-95, Tim Harris confessed to her murder. Despite the medical examiner's report that showed that Lorraine had probably been beaten severely around her head and shoulders, Tim would insist it was Lorraine who had begged him to have sex with her. He told investigators that she had been a nice person who sympathized with his anger over his wife divorcing him. At some point, he seemed to have snapped, and the rage he felt towards Sandy, he transferred to Lorraine. Tim Harris insisted that he couldn't remember exactly when or why he had posed her dead body so suggestively around the trunk of the pine tree, any more than he could remember having forced Lorraine into his cruiser, commanded his dog to attack if she resisted, and then dragged her out of the cruiser and into the thicket of pine and palmetto trees, where he raped and killed her. On Friday, September 28, 1990, Tim Harris avoided a jury trial and possible death sentence by appearing before a judge, admitting that he had killed Lorraine Hendricks and pleading no contest to first-degree murder charges. Tim Harris was sentenced to life in prison with a mandatory sentence of at least 25 years. Even though the ex-Florida trooper became eligible for parole in 2015, as of today, he remains incarcerated at Hardy Correctional Institute in Bowling Green, Florida. Thank you to crime writer Ann Rule, whose 1994 book, titled You Belong to Me, was our major source of information for writing this podcast. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please read a bedtime story to the 5-star review button, and then tuck them gently into their beds and give them a kiss on their forehead, and then once they peacefully doze off to sleep, proceed to scream death metal music directly into their ears. Also, please subscribe to the MrBallen podcast on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, Google, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories we have posted on our main YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. We now have a registered 501c3 charitable organization called the MrBallen Foundation that makes it as easy as possible for you to join me, my family, and my team in supporting those whose lives have been most impacted by violent and heinous crimes. Monthly donors to the MrBallen Foundation Honor Them Society will receive free gifts and exclusive invites to special live events. But the real reward is helping to create a new ending to the story for victims of violent crime. Go to MrBallen.Foundation and click Get Involved to join the Honor Them Society today. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username is just @MrBallen, and I really do read the majority of my DMs. Lastly, we have some really cool merchandise, so head on over to shopmrballen.com to have a look. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya.